If you had asked me, at 46 years old, what I thought family meant, I would have told you it meant showing up. Not the big, dramatic showing up you see in movies. The showing up that nobody claps for. Driving 2 hours on a Tuesday because someone needs a ride to a doctor's appointment. Remembering the anniversary of a death nobody else remembers. Answering the phone at 11 at night because it's your name in someone's contacts under "in case of emergency," even when you were never quite sure why your name was the one they picked. I believed that for 32 years. I believed it right up until the day I sat in a lawyer's office in a beige suit that was too warm for June, listening to a woman I had called Mom for 3 decades explain to a room full of people that I had never really been family at all. Not legally, not really. Just a girl who happened to grow up in the house. My name is Claire Bennett. This is the story of how I found out what my father actually wanted, and what it cost the people who tried to bury it. It is a long story, because the truth I eventually uncovered took years to fully surface, and because I have come to believe that stories about quiet, patient justice deserve to be told with the same patience they actually required to live through. I was 12 when my mother died. Susan Bennett, quiet, funny in a dry way that took people a beat to catch. The kind of woman who kept a garden nobody asked her to keep and somehow made the whole street smell like tomatoes every August. She died on a Thursday in March. An aneurysm. No warning, no goodbye. One day she was standing at the stove. The next day she wasn't anywhere at all. My father, Robert Bennett, did not know how to be alone. I don't say that as an insult. Some people are built for solitude, and some people simply are not. And my father was a man who needed someone across the table from him at dinner, or the silence in the house became something with weight and teeth. He ran a hardware and lumber supply company in Millbrook, a small town about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio. Bennett Hardware and Supply, a name that had been on that building since his own father hung the sign in 1961. He was good at building things and terrible at being still, and after my mother died, he filled the stillness the only way he knew how. 2 years later, he married Diane Whitfield. Diane came with 2 kids of her own, Mark, who was 16 when I was 14, and Ashley, who was 11. Diane was polished in a way my mother never bothered to be. She wore lipstick to the grocery store. She redid the kitchen within 4 months of moving in, tore out my mother's yellow tile with the little painted birds on it, and put in white marble that she said was more timeless. I remember standing in the doorway watching a man with a sledgehammer break my mother's kitchen into pieces, and thinking that this was probably a metaphor for something, even though I was 14 and didn't have the words for it yet. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, even now. Diane was never cruel in the way that makes a good villain in a movie. She never screamed at me. She never hit me. What she did was quieter and, in its own way, more thorough. She had a gift for making you feel like a guest in a house you'd lived in your whole life. She would introduce me at church functions as Robert's daughter from his first marriage, in a tone that made the word first sound like a rough draft. She kept photographs of Mark and Ashley in every room, graduation photos, sports photos, school photos, and somehow there was never quite room on the wall for mine. When I made honor roll, it went on the refrigerator for a week. When Ashley made the cheer squad, Diane threw a dinner. My father didn't see it, or didn't want to. I've turned that over in my head more times than I can count in the years since. I don't think he was a coward, not exactly. I think he was a man so afraid of losing a second wife that he decided not to notice the small ways the first daughter was being sanded down to fit around her. He worked long hours at the store. He came home tired. He loved me. I want to be clear about that, because everything that follows might make you doubt it, and you shouldn't. He loved me. He just didn't fight for me, And there's a particular kind of loneliness in being loved by someone who won't stand between you and the person hurting you. I left for Ohio State at 18, and I did not come back for holidays if I could help it. I told myself it was because of the drive, or my class schedule, or my part-time job at a campus bookstore. It was none of those things. It was because every time I walked back into that house, I became 14 again. The girl standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her mother's tile get broken into pieces nobody thought were worth saving. But here is the thing about fathers, even imperfect ones, even ones who don't fight hard enough. You don't stop loving them just because they disappoint you. I called him every Sunday for 28 years. Not Diane, not Mark or Ashley. My father. We talked about the store, about the Buckeyes, about nothing much at all. And it was enough, because it was ours. When I got married at 26, to a good, steady man named James who sells commercial insurance and has never once made me feel like a rough draft of anyone, my father walked me down the aisle and cried in a way I had only seen him cry once before, at my mother's funeral. When my son Ben was born, my father drove the 2 hours to the hospital before Diane even knew I was in labor, because I called him first, the way I'd always called him first, the way I always would. He got sick when I was 43. Pancreatic cancer, the bad kind, the kind where the doctors use the word manage instead of cure from the very first appointment. I drove to Millbrook every weekend for the 14 months he was sick. I sat with him during chemo. I learned to make the bland little meals that were the only thing his stomach could hold down. I fought with the insurance company on his behalf for 6 hours one Tuesday, because Diane said she didn't have the patience for that kind of thing. I was there, in the room, holding his hand, the night he died in March. The same month my mother had died, 31 years before, though I don't think that was anything but a cruel coincidence. I want you to remember all of that. I want you to hold on to it, because 6 weeks after we buried my father, I sat in a conference room and was told, calmly, by the woman who had spent 3 decades making sure I knew I wasn't quite family, that I wasn't entitled to a single thing he'd built. The lawyer's name was Gerald Foss, a family friend of Diane's, not the attorney who had handled my father's affairs for the 20 years prior. That detail didn't strike me as strange until much later. At the time, grief makes you stupid about details. Grief makes you sit in a room and accept whatever is put in front of you, because some animal part of your brain has decided that arguing is more than you can survive right now. There were 5 of us in the room: Diane, Mark, Ashley, myself, and James, who had come along because he is the kind of husband who shows up to things even when you tell him he doesn't have to. Gerald Foss had thin, careful hands and a way of not quite looking at me when he spoke, which I noticed and filed away without understanding yet why it mattered. "The will is fairly straightforward," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "Robert's estate consists primarily of the house on Cedar Lane, the business, Bennett Hardware, and roughly $210,000 in various accounts and investments." I nodded. I already knew, in the vague way you know things about your own family, that the house had been paid off for years and that the store, while not a fortune, was a solid, steady business that had supported us my whole childhood and then some. "Per the terms of the will," Gerald Foss continued, "the house on Cedar Lane and the business are left in full to Diane Bennett. The remaining liquid assets are to be divided between Diane, Mark, and Ashley Whitfield." The room was quiet. I remember the specific quality of that quiet. Not shocked silence, because shock takes a second to arrive, but a kind of pre-shock stillness, like the pause right before you touch something you already suspect will be hot. "I'm sorry," I said. "What about me?" Gerald Foss did look at me then, briefly, and something in his face made my stomach drop before he even said the words. "There's no provision for you in this document, Claire." I want to describe what that felt like, but I'm not sure language does it justice. It wasn't like being punched. It was more like watching the floor get pulled out from under a house you didn't realize you were still standing in. 32 years of Sunday phone calls. 14 months of chemo appointments and insurance calls and bland little meals. A childhood spent watching my mother's kitchen tile get replaced by someone else's marble. None of it, apparently, had bought me so much as a line in a legal document. "There has to be a mistake," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, which I would later understand was the first small piece of a lesson I was about to spend the next 8 months learning. That steadiness, real steadiness, is not the absence of feeling. It's what you do with the feeling once it arrives. "There's no mistake," Diane said. She said it quickly, too quickly, the way people talk when they've rehearsed a line and are afraid of losing their nerve if they slow down. "Your father made this decision a long time ago, Claire, before he got sick. He wanted the house and the business to stay in the family that had built a life there together. The family that had built a life there together. As though I had been renting a room in that house for 18 years instead of growing up in it. As though the tomato garden and the yellow tile and my mother's whole buried life had never happened at all. I am his family," I said. Diane's face did something complicated then. A flicker of something that might have been guilt, quickly smoothed back into the composed, sympathetic expression she'd clearly practiced for this exact moment. "Of course you are, sweetheart. This isn't about that. This is just about what made sense for the business and the house, practically speaking. Mark's been working there part-time. Ashley and her husband are thinking about settling in Millbrook. It made sense to your father to keep things simple. Mark, who I should mention had worked at Bennett Hardware for a grand total of 8 months in the 2 years since he'd been fired from a car dealership, would not meet my eyes." Ashley studied her phone like it contained the secrets of the universe. I looked at Gerald Foss. "When was this will signed?" He checked the document. "January of 2 years ago." 2 years ago. Before the diagnosis, yes, technically, but not by much. My father had started having the stomach pains that first sent him to the doctor only 4 months after that date. And something about the specific coldness of the language, the phrase, "the family that had built a life there together," sounded nothing like my father, who called things by their plain names and had never in his life used the word practically to describe a decision about people he loved. I didn't say anything else in that room. I want you to understand that this wasn't dignity, not yet. It was closer to paralysis. James put his hand on my knee under the table, and I remember focusing on that pressure, on the warmth of his palm through my slacks, because it was the only solid thing in a room that had just stopped making sense. We drove home in silence. It was James who finally spoke, 40 minutes into the drive, somewhere around the exit for Grove City. "Claire," he said carefully, "I don't think that will sound like your dad." I stared out the window at the gray Ohio highway, at the flat fields turning green with early spring, and I said the thing that had been sitting underneath my ribs since the moment Gerald Foss slid that folder across the table. Neither do I. I am an accountant. I want to mention that now, because it becomes relevant, and also because it explains something about how I process the world when it stops making sense. When my mother died, I found comfort in numbers because numbers don't leave you. 2 plus 2 is 2 plus 2, whether your mother is alive or in the ground. I built a career out of that comfort, first as a junior associate at a firm in Columbus, then, after 12 years, opening my own small practice specializing in estate and small business accounting. It is, I'll admit, a strange kind of irony that I had spent 2 decades helping other families untangle exactly the sort of mess I was now standing in the middle of myself. The Monday after the reading, I did what I always do when something doesn't add up. I started pulling the thread. The first call I made was to Frank Whitaker. Frank had been my father's attorney for as long as I could remember. He'd handled the paperwork when Dad bought the second warehouse in 1998. He'd helped him incorporate the business properly in 2003. And he'd been the one to sit with my father and me, just the two of us, in the spring after my mother died, to help my father understand what needed to happen with her small estate. Frank Whitaker was not Gerald Foss. Frank Whitaker had known my father for 35 years. Frank Whitaker had known me since I was 12 years old. Sniffling in his office waiting room while my father filled out paperwork he could barely see through his own tears. I hadn't thought of calling Frank until 2 days after the reading, and when I did think of it, it arrived with a jolt, the way an obvious thing does when grief has been sitting on top of it. Why hadn't Frank Whitaker been the one to read my father's will? His office was a converted house on Main Street in Millbrook, the kind of law practice that still had a receptionist named Carol, who'd worked there since before I was born. Carol's face did something when I walked in. A flicker of surprise, quickly covered. That I filed away the same way I'd filed away Gerald Foss's refusal to meet my eyes. "Claire," Frank said, coming around his desk to hug me. He was 71 now, silver-haired, still sharp-eyed behind reading glasses that were always sliding down his nose. "I am so sorry about your dad. I should have called. I've been meaning to call." "Frank," I said, sitting down across from him, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, even if it's uncomfortable." "Always," he said, and I believed him, because in 32 years I had never once known Frank Whitaker to say something he didn't mean. "Did you write my father's will?" Frank's face changed. Not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it. Concern, maybe, laced with a caution I didn't understand yet. "I wrote a will for your father in 2015, he said slowly. "After your mother's estate was settled and he and Diane got remarried situations sorted with the prenup. That will left the house and the business to you, Claire, with provisions for Diane to remain in the house for her lifetime if she outlived him, and a smaller cash inheritance divided between Mark and Ashley in recognition of their place in the family. It was a fair document. Your father was proud of it. He told me himself it let him sleep at night, knowing the store would stay with someone who understood what it meant to him." I felt something cold move through my chest. "That's not the will that was read on Thursday." Frank went very still. "What do you mean?" I told him about Gerald Foss, about the conference room, about the house and the business going to Diane, about the phrase, "the family that had built a life there together," about the January date 2 years prior. Frank took off his glasses and pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose, an old, tired gesture I recognized from every difficult conversation I'd ever watched him have. "Claire," he said, "I have never once heard of an attorney named Gerald Foss in 35 years of practicing law in this county. And your father never once, in the 4 years after I drafted that will, came to me to revise it. If a new will exists, either your father executed it with a different attorney entirely and never told me, which, frankly, would surprise me, because Robert Bennett told me everything, including things I frankly didn't need to know about his cholesterol. Or something else happened." "Or something else happened," I repeated. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Frank said carefully, the lawyer in him rising to the surface even as the old family friend in him looked pained. "But I would very much like to see a copy of that document." I got him one within the hour. Gerald Foss's office had emailed a PDF to all of us the day after the reading, a small mercy of modern estate law. Frank read it twice, his frown deepening with each page, and then he set it down on his desk with the careful, deliberate motion of a man handling something he suspects might be radioactive. "There are things about this document that concern me," he said. "The notarization is from a notary I don't recognize, working out of a UPS store in Grove City, which is not where your father would have had any reason to be. The witness signatures are a name I don't know, and this is the part that concerns me most. Diane's own signature appears as a witness on an earlier page, which is itself unusual, though not automatically disqualifying. And the language, Claire. The language doesn't sound like your father. Your father used to fight me on every clause because he wanted plain English, not lawyer language. He hated the word practically. He told me once it was a weasel word. This will is full of language your father would have made me rewrite 3 times. So what do I do? Frank looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face softened into the expression I remembered from being 12 years old in his waiting room. You do what your father would have wanted you to do, he said. You find out the truth. Quietly, carefully, and with evidence, not accusations. If this document is what your father actually wanted, however painful that is, you'll have your answer, and you'll have to make your peace with it. But if it isn't, if someone altered your father's wishes while he was sick and scared and dying, then you owe it to him, and to yourself, to prove it. I drove to Bennett Hardware the next morning before it opened, using the key I'd had on my ring since I was 16 years old, back when my father used to let me open the register on Saturdays and count the till while he unlocked the loading dock. The smell hit me the way it always did. Sawdust and motor oil and the particular metallic scent of 1,000 nails in 1,000 bins. A smell I associated so completely with my father that walking into that building without him in it felt like walking into a room where someone had just turned off all the lights. I wasn't there to be sentimental, though. I was there because I am an accountant, and because Frank Whitaker's careful words, find out the truth, quietly, carefully, and with evidence, had lodged themselves in my chest like a splinter I couldn't stop working at. The store's books were a mess. Not criminally so, not yet, but the kind of mess that told a story if you knew how to read it. In the 18 months since my father's diagnosis, Mark had been listed as assistant manager with a salary that had quietly doubled, despite the store's revenue dropping nearly 20% over the same period. There were 4 separate cash withdrawals in the 6 months before my father's death, each just under the $10,000 reporting threshold, each authorized with my father's electronic signature during weeks when I personally remembered him being too sick from chemo to sit upright at a desk, let alone log into online banking. There was a vendor account, a consulting line item, paid out monthly to a company called Whitfield Strategic Solutions, LLC, a business I had never heard of, for an amount that had increased 3 times in the past year alone. Whitfield, Diane's maiden name. I sat in my father's old office chair, the leather worn into the shape of a man who'd spent 30 years in that seat, and I felt something shift inside me. Not the sharp, hot fury I might have expected, but something colder and steadier. Something that felt less like anger and more like resolve settling into my bones like sediment. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who has ever been the quiet one in a family, the one who keeps the peace, the one who shows up and doesn't make waves. For 32 years, I had been that person. I had swallowed the small slights, the photographs that never made the wall, the dinners that were never thrown in my honor, because I told myself that dignity meant not making a scene, that love meant giving people the benefit of the doubt even when they hadn't earned it. Sitting in that office looking at 4 unexplained cash withdrawals and a consulting payment to a company with my stepmother's maiden name on it, I understood for the first time that dignity and silence are not the same thing. That you can be calm and still demand the truth. That the quietest people in a room are sometimes the ones about to do the most. I photographed every document. I made copies of every statement, every ledger page, every vendor invoice. And then I locked the office, and I drove to see the one person in Millbrook who might know what Whitfield Strategic Solutions, LLC, actually was. Before I go further, I need to tell you about the garden, because it matters to what comes next, and because I think you should know the kind of woman my mother was before I tell you what I found buried, almost literally, because of her. My mother, Susan Bennett, grew tomatoes the way some people practice religion. Every spring she would till a strip of earth along the back fence of the Cedar Lane house, 6 raised rows, heirloom varieties with names like Cherokee Purple and Mortgage Lifter, and by August the whole yard would smell green and sweet and alive. She used to say that a garden was the only honest thing in the world because it didn't care how you felt about it. It only cared whether you showed up and did the work. When Diane redid the kitchen 4 months into her marriage to my father, the garden went next. Not immediately. Diane wasn't cruel enough, or perhaps wasn't confident enough yet, to erase my mother's whole life in one summer. But by my sophomore year of high school, the tomato beds had been replaced with a stone patio and a small fountain Diane had seen in a magazine, and my mother's raised beds existed only in photographs and in my own memory, and in one place I did not know about yet, which is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. My father, in the last year of his life, had asked me to help him go through some boxes in the garage, old tax documents mostly, things he wanted shredded before he was gone, a task he'd approached with the same brisk practicality he'd brought to everything else, as though preparing for his own death was simply another item on a to-do list. Buried in one of those boxes, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag and taped shut, I had found a small tin, the kind that used to hold Danish butter cookies, filled with seed packets, Cherokee Purple, Mortgage Lifter, brandy wine, my mother's tomato seeds, saved and dated in her own looping handwriting, some of them nearly 30 years old. I hadn't understood at the time why my father had kept them, or why he'd looked at that tin with such a strange private grief when I found it, or why he'd said quietly, almost to himself, "I should have planted these years ago." I'd assumed it was simple sentimentality, a widower's guilt over a garden he'd let die along with his first wife. I understood it differently 3 weeks after the reading of the will, when I got a call from a man named Curtis Doyle, who identified himself as the manager of a self-storage facility on Route 40, informing me that a unit under my father's name was 3 months behind on payments and would be auctioned off within the week unless someone claimed it. I had never heard of a storage unit. Neither, as it turned out, had Diane, or if she had, she'd never once mentioned it to me, which, given everything else, told its own story. The unit was small, 10 by 10, and when Curtis Doyle rolled up the metal door, I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I could make myself step inside. It smelled like my father's garage, motor oil and old cardboard and, underneath it, faintly, his aftershave, as though some part of him still lingered in the fabric of the boxes he'd left behind. There wasn't much. A few pieces of furniture I didn't recognize. An old roll-top desk, a filing cabinet with a broken lock, 3 boxes marked in my father's careful block handwriting. Claire, taxes 2019 to 2021. Susan. I sat down on an overturned milk crate, and I opened the box marked with my mother's name first, because some instinct told me it mattered, and because I wasn't ready yet to open the one with my own. Inside were things I hadn't seen in over 30 years. My mother's recipe cards, her handwriting looping and certain. A cardigan that still, impossibly, held a ghost of her perfume. Photographs I'd never seen. My parents young and laughing on a beach somewhere. My mother pregnant with me, round and radiant in a way the woman I remembered, tired and gardening in her 40s, never quite was in my memory. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, the Danish cookie tin of tomato seeds. Except this time there was a note tucked inside, folded into quarters, in my father's handwriting. For Claire, when she's ready to plant something that's actually hers. I sat on that milk crate and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the funeral. Not delicate tears, but the ugly, gulping kind. The kind that comes from a place so deep you don't have any control over the sound it makes coming out. Curtis Doyle, to his credit, quietly stepped outside and gave me 20 minutes alone with my grief and my mother's seeds. The box marked Claire was the one that changed everything. Inside was a manila envelope, sealed, with my name written across the front in my father's handwriting, and beneath it, a flash drive taped to an index card that read, in the same block letters, "Watch this first." I drove home with both items on the passenger seat like they might combust if I looked away from them too long. James was waiting when I got there. Frank Whitaker had called him, unable to reach me directly, worried when I hadn't answered my phone for 3 hours. We sat together at the kitchen table, and I plugged the flash drive into my laptop, and my father's face filled the screen. He looked thin. Sicker than I remembered him being in the video. This must have been recorded not long before the end, in a period I had somehow, mercifully, not witnessed, because I'd gone home for 2 days that week to handle a work emergency, the only 2 days in 14 months I hadn't been at his bedside, and I felt a fresh stab of grief and guilt watching him now, alone in what I recognized as his hospital room, recording a message to a daughter who wasn't there. "Claire," he said, and his voice was rougher than I remembered, worn thin by the chemo and the tubes, and whatever else that disease had done to him in its last cruel months. "If you're watching this, it means one of two things. Either I finally worked up the nerve to give this to you myself, sitting across the table, the way I should have, or I didn't, and I ran out of time, and Frank had to point you here after I was gone. Knowing me, it's probably the second one. I was never good at hard conversations, sweetheart. Your mother used to say that about me. She was right about most things." He coughed, took a sip of water from a straw someone off camera handed him, and continued. "I need to tell you some things I should have told you years ago. About the store, about the house, about your mother's garden, and about Diane. When your mother died," my father said on that recording, his eyes fixed somewhere just past the camera, the way people look when they're trying to organize thoughts they've been carrying too long. "I was 49 years old and I didn't know how to exist in a quiet house. I know I've never said that to you directly, but I think you knew it anyway. You were always sharper than I gave you credit for, even at 12. I married Diane too fast. I want to say that plainly because I never have. Not to you, not to anyone, not even to myself most days. I married her because the house was too quiet and because she was kind to me when I was drowning, and I mistook that kindness for love, and by the time I understood the difference, we had a life built together and a mortgage, and 2 more kids in the house, and I didn't know how to undo it. And honestly, sweetheart, I didn't want to. I wanted it to work. I wanted, more than almost anything, for you to have a mother again, even an imperfect one, and I think in trying so hard to make that happen, I let her get away with things I shouldn't have. I saw what she did, Claire. I want you to know that. I saw the way she introduced you at church. I saw the way your report cards went into a drawer, while Ashley's cheerleading trophies went on the mantle. I told myself I was keeping the peace by not saying anything, but the truth is, I was a coward, and I let my own daughter grow up feeling like a guest in her own home, and there is no version of this recording where I don't have to say that plainly and ask you to forgive me for it. Even though I know forgiveness isn't something you owe me just because I'm dying and scared and finally telling the truth. 2 years ago, I changed my will. I felt James's hand find mine under the table, the same gesture from the lawyer's office, the only steady thing in a room that kept refusing to hold still. I want to be honest about why. I found out. I won't tell you how, it doesn't matter now, that Diane had been moving money out of the business. Small amounts, careful amounts, routed through a consulting company she'd set up under her maiden name, money that should have gone back into inventory or into the retirement fund I'd been building for 30 years. When I confronted her, she cried and told me it was for Mark, that Mark was in trouble. Gambling debts. Claire, real trouble. The kind of trouble that has men showing up at your door. And that she'd been desperate and hadn't known what else to do. And she begged me not to tell you or Ashley. And God help me, I believed she was sorry. And I let it go because I didn't want to blow up a marriage in the middle of my own life, falling apart with a cancer diagnosis I hadn't even told you about yet. But I wasn't a fool, sweetheart, whatever else I was. I went to Frank, and I asked him what would happen to the business, to the house, to everything your grandfather built, if I let things stay the way they were on paper. And Frank told me the truth, the way he always has, which is that if I died with things as they stood, you would inherit what I'd always intended you to inherit. The house, the business, the bulk of the estate. And Diane would have her right to remain in the house for her lifetime, and Mark and Ashley would have a fair, generous, but limited inheritance, enough to help, but not enough to enable whatever mess Mark had gotten himself into. That will still exists, Claire. Frank has it. I never changed it. Not really. Not in any way that would hold up. Because I never signed anything different in front of him, and Frank Whitaker doesn't let clients sign things they haven't read 3 times. If someone has shown you a different document, and knowing Diane's growing desperation these past months, knowing what I've started to suspect about the store's books since I got too sick to check them myself, I think someone might. I need you to know it isn't mine. I never signed anything giving her the house and the business outright. I would never have done that to you. Not after everything. Not after the way you showed up for me every single week these past 14 months, while your own stepbrother couldn't be bothered to visit more than twice. I should have handled this while I still had the strength to sit across from you and say all of this out loud. I'm sorry that I didn't. I'm sorry for a lot of things, sweetheart, but I am not sorry that you are my daughter. And I am not sorry for one single Sunday phone call in 32 years. And I need you to know that whatever happens with the house, with the store, with any of it, you were never, for one single day, a guest in this family. You were the whole reason I understood what family meant to hold on to, even when I was too weak to protect it the way I should have. Plant your mother's tomatoes, Claire. Get the truth from Frank. And don't let anyone tell you that being quiet all these years meant you didn't have a spine. I watched you hold your ground in rooms full of people who underestimated you for 32 years. I have never once doubted what you're capable of when you finally decide to use it. The video ended there. I sat at my kitchen table with my husband's hand wrapped around mine, and I did not move for a long time. The manila envelope, it turned out, held exactly what my father's video had promised. A full copy of the 2015 Will E., the real one, notarized properly, witnessed by Carol from Frank's office, and a bank teller named Dolores Reyes, whose signature, I would later confirm, matched bank records going back a decade. A handwritten letter, 3 pages, elaborating on things the video hadn't covered. Specific concerns about the consulting payments, a list of dates when he'd noticed discrepancies in the store's books, and, most damning of all, a photocopy of a bank statement showing a $14,000 wire transfer from Bennett Hardware's operating account to an account in Mark's name, dated 3 weeks before my father's death, a period during which my father had been, according to his own hospice records, unconscious for 11 of those 21 days. There was no way my father had authorized that transfer. There was no way, medically, that he could have. I called Frank Whitaker the next morning and told him everything: the video, the letter, the bank statement, the storage unit my stepmother had apparently either never known about or deliberately never mentioned. Frank was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. "Claire," he said finally, "I need you to understand what this means. If what you're describing is accurate, We're not just looking at a disputed will anymore. We're looking at potential elder financial abuse, potential forgery, and possibly a fraudulent document submitted to probate court by someone claiming to be a licensed notary who I have never once, in 35 years, encountered in this county. This is bigger than a family disagreement. This is something a prosecutor might have an interest in. I don't want to destroy her, I said, and I meant it, even then, even furious, even grieving. I don't want Mark in prison. I want the truth. I want what my father actually wanted. Then let's get it, Frank said. Quietly, carefully, with evidence, just like I told you. But Claire, quiet doesn't mean weak. I need you to understand that going forward. There is nothing quiet about what you're about to do to that fraudulent will. It is going to hit that family like a very calm, very devastating storm. I want to tell you about Mark, because I think it's easy in a story like this to make him into a simple villain, and the truth, as it usually is with people, was more complicated than that. Mark Whitfield was not a cruel person, not fundamentally. He was, I came to understand over the following months, a deeply weak one, which is its own kind of damage when it collides with other people's lives. He'd struggled with gambling since his 20s. First sports betting, then, as the apps made it easier and easier to lose money without ever touching a physical casino. Something closer to a full-blown addiction that had, by the time my father got sick, buried him under nearly $80,000 of debt, some of it to legitimate sportsbooks, some of it, more alarmingly, to people who did not send polite collection letters when payments were missed. Diane had known for over a year. She had been quietly bailing him out, first from her own savings, then, when those ran dry, from the consulting payments she'd started rooting out of Bennett Hardware. Telling herself, I think, some version of the story every desperate parent tells themselves, that it was temporary, that she'd pay it back, that she was protecting her son from something worse than a father-in-law's disappointment. What she hadn't planned on was my father getting sick fast enough and dying soon enough. That temporary became permanent unless she found a way to make the debt disappear entirely. That, as far as I've ever been able to piece together, and I want to be honest that some of this is inference, corroborated later by things Ashley eventually told me, rather than something I can prove beyond doubt, is when Diane found Gerald Foss, a man who, it turned out, was not an attorney at all, but a paralegal who had lost his license 11 years earlier after a nearly identical scheme involving an elderly client in Franklin County, and who now made a quiet, dirty living helping desperate people produce convincing fake legal documents for a fee. The $14,000 wire transfer, made while my father lay unconscious in a hospice bed, was the last of it. One final infusion to keep Mark's creditors at bay, long enough for the fraudulent will to clear probate, and the house to be sold. Quietly, sometime in the next year or two, once enough time had passed that nobody would think to ask too many questions. I don't say any of this to excuse what Diane did. I say it because understanding it made something in me settle, finally, into something other than raw fury. This wasn't a woman who had simply never loved me enough. This was a woman who had made a series of small, desperate, self-protective choices over 3 decades, each one slightly worse than the last, until they added up to forging a dying man's final wishes. It didn't make it forgivable, but it made it, finally, understandable. And understanding a thing, I was learning, is the first step toward being able to walk away from it with your own hands clean. I didn't go to Cedar Lane to yell. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories usually go in people's imaginations. The dramatic confrontation, the raised voices, the slammed door. That's not what happened, and honestly, by the time I stood on that porch again, 3 weeks after watching my father's face on a laptop screen telling me the truth he'd been too afraid to say out loud, I didn't have any interest in giving Diane the satisfaction of a scene she could later describe as me losing control or not handling my grief well. I had learned over 3 decades of being underestimated in that house that composure was its own kind of power, and I intended to use every bit of it. James stayed in the car. This was something I needed to do alone, the same way I'd needed to sit alone in that storage unit with my mother's tomato seeds. Diane answered the door in a cardigan I didn't recognize, and something in her face, a flicker, quickly suppressed, told me she already knew on some animal level why I'd come. Grief does something to people's instincts. So does guilt. "Claire," she said, "I wasn't expecting you." "I found the storage unit, Diane." I watched her face very carefully as I said it, and I will tell you honestly, some small, still hopeful part of me had been holding out for confusion, for genuine surprise, for some version of this conversation where it turned out to be a misunderstanding after all, where Diane was as much a victim of Gerald Foss as I was. That hope died in the half-second it took her face to go from carefully blank to something closer to defeated. "Can I come in?" I asked. This isn't a conversation for the porch. We sat in the living room, my mother's old living room, though nothing in it remained to prove that anymore, the furniture replaced twice over in 30 years, the walls a soft gray that had once been the pale yellow my mother chose. Diane sat very straight on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, and for the first time in 32 years I watched her look genuinely, completely uncertain of what to say. "I have a video of my father," I said, recorded from his hospice bed, explaining that he never signed the will Gerald Foss read to us. "I have a copy of the real will, notarized and witnessed properly, dated 2015, that leaves the house and the business to me, with a lifetime right for you to remain in this house if you choose. I have a letter in my father's handwriting describing the consulting payments you routed through Whitfield Strategic Solutions, and I have a bank statement showing a $14,000 wire transfer out of Bennett Hardware, made 3 weeks before he died, during a period when he was documented as unconscious for 11 of those 21 days." Diane's hands, folded in her lap, had begun to tremble very slightly. She didn't say anything. "I know about Mark," I said, more gently than I expected to be able to manage. "I know about the gambling. I know you were scared, and I know you love your son, and I even understand, in some small way, why a scared, desperate person might convince themselves that a dying man wouldn't notice, or wouldn't mind, or would forgive it later, if it ever came out. I understand desperation, Diane. What I don't understand, what I don't think I will ever be able to make peace with, is that you let a man forge my father's final wishes while he was too sick to defend himself, and then you sat across a table from me 6 weeks after we buried him and told me, to my face, that I wasn't entitled to a single thing he built, that I wasn't real family. After 32 years, after 14 months of chemo appointments, after I called him every single Sunday of my adult life, while your own son couldn't be bothered to visit more than twice in the entire time he was dying. I never said you weren't real family, Diane said, and her voice cracked on the word family in a way that might have moved me once before I'd watched a video of my father crying in a hospice bed about exactly this. You said the house and the business should stay with the family that had built a life there together, I said. I was in the room, Diane. I remember the words. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all of its careful, composed polish, and for the first time in 3 decades, I heard something that sounded almost like the truth. I panicked, she said. Mark came to me 18 months ago, sobbing, terrified, telling me men had shown up at his apartment. I didn't know what else to do. Your father was already so sick. I told myself I'd fix it before it mattered, that I'd pay it back somehow, that none of it would matter once. She stopped herself, but I understood the rest of the sentence anyway. Once your father was gone and nobody was checking the books anymore. And then he got sicker faster than you expected, I said. And you ran out of time to quietly fix it, so you found Gerald Foss instead. She didn't deny it. She sat on the edge of that sofa in my mother's old living room, in a house my grandfather had built the family business to support, and she didn't deny a single word of it. And something in me, some last small hope that this was all a misunderstanding, some last small piece of the 14-year-old girl who'd wanted more than anything for her new stepmother to love her, finally, quietly, let go. I'm going to file a probate challenge, I told her. I'm going to submit the real will, my father's video statement, and the financial evidence. Frank Whitaker believes I have more than enough to have the fraudulent document invalidated. I want you to hear this from me, directly, rather than from a process server. I am not doing this to destroy Mark or to send anyone to prison. I am doing this because my father asked me to, from a hospital bed, in what might have been the most honest conversation he and I ever had. What happens to Gerald Foss, and whether the district attorney has an interest in a wire transfer made while my father was unconscious, is out of my hands and, frankly, out of yours too, now. I stood up to leave. At the door, Diane said my name, and I turned back. And for a moment I thought she might finally apologize. Not for the will, not for the money, but for the smaller, older thing. The photographs that never made the wall, the church introductions, the 32 years of being made to feel like a guest in my own life. Your father loved you very much, she said instead. I want you to know that. Whatever else you think of me. I know he did, I said. I have it on video. I walked out to the car where James was waiting, and I did not cry until we were 3 blocks away, and even then, it wasn't the ugly, gulping grief of the storage unit. It was something quieter, something that felt, strangely, like relief. Frank Whitaker filed the probate challenge on a Tuesday morning in late July, 4 months after my father's death. The document was thorough in a way that surprised even me. 41 pages, including notarized copies of the 2015 will, a full transcript of my father's video statement, the forensic bank records I'd compiled during my own investigation of the store's books, and a formal complaint against Gerald Foss, whose real name, it turned out, was Gerald Fossick, filed with both the Ohio Bar Association's Unauthorized Practice of Law Division and the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. Frank had also, quietly, hired an actual forensic accountant, not because he doubted my own numbers, he assured me, but because a challenge like this needed a neutral third-party expert whose findings couldn't be dismissed as a biased daughter with a grudge. The forensic accountant, a meticulous, soft-spoken woman named Priya Anand, spent 3 weeks going through Bennett Hardware's financial records and came back with a report that was, if anything, more damning than my own preliminary findings. Nearly $91,000 had been moved out of the business over the 18 months of my father's illness, routed primarily through the Whitfield Strategic Solutions account, with a smaller but still significant amount traced directly to accounts controlled by Mark. The response from Diane's side came through an actual attorney this time, a real one. A defense attorney named Patricia Kwan, who specialized, I would later learn, in exactly this kind of family financial dispute, and whose first move was to request a private mediation session rather than let the matter proceed to a public probate hearing. That's actually good news, Frank told me over the phone. It means her attorney has looked at the evidence and told her, in no uncertain terms, that she doesn't have a case. Mediation means she's trying to minimize the damage, not fight the substance of what you've found. What does minimizing the damage look like? I asked. Usually, Frank said, It looks like an agreement to relinquish any claim to the estate, in exchange for you agreeing not to pursue the matter as far as it could legally go. If the DA takes an interest in that wire transfer and forgery of a will, financial exploitation of an elder, that's serious enough that they might. Diane and possibly Mark could be looking at criminal charges, not just a lost inheritance. Her attorney is almost certainly trying to negotiate her way out of that outcome by giving you everything you're legally owed without a fight. I sat with that for a long moment. And if I don't agree to drop the criminal complaint? Then it's out of everyone's hands, Frank said. The DA decides. Not you, not me, not Patricia Kwan. But I suspect that's exactly what Diane is afraid of, and exactly why she's suddenly very motivated to settle quickly and quietly. Of everyone in that family, Ashley was the one who surprised me most. I had always thought of Ashley as a smaller, softer version of Diane, polished, a little vain, comfortably content to let her mother and brother make the decisions while she enjoyed whatever benefits trickled down. We had never been close. She was 3 years younger than me, and by the time she was old enough to really understand the dynamics of our house, I had already mostly checked out emotionally, already spending as much time as I could at friends' houses or, later, at college, leaving Ashley to grow up as Diane's genuinely biological, genuinely favored daughter without much competition from me at all. She called me 2 days after Patricia Kwan requested mediation, and her voice on the phone was different than I had ever heard it. Smaller, scared, stripped of the easy confidence I associated with her. "I didn't know," she said, before I'd even finished saying hello. "Claire, I swear to you, I didn't know about the wire transfer. I didn't know about the fake lawyer. I knew Mark had money problems. Everyone knew that. He's been a mess for years. But I thought Mom was just helping him with a loan, like a normal parent thing. Not this. Not forging Dad's will. I need you to believe me." I didn't say anything for a moment, turning it over. "Why are you calling me, Ashley?" "Because I think Mom's going to try to make this look like it was all Mark's idea, or all Gerald Fossick's idea. And I don't think that's fair. And I don't—" Her voice broke. "I don't want you to think I was part of it. Because I wasn't. And also because—" She stopped again, and when she continued, it came out in a rush, like she'd been holding it in for years and the dam had finally cracked. "Because I've felt guilty for a long time about how Mom treated you, and I never said anything. Because it was easier not to. Because it meant more attention for me. And I think that makes me a coward, and I'm sorry, Claire. I've been sorry for a long time. I just never said it." I want to be honest. I didn't fully forgive Ashley in that conversation. Forgiveness, I was learning, isn't a switch you flip, because someone finally says the right words after 20 years of silence. But I did believe her. And belief, it turns out, is its own kind of foundation to build something on later, slowly, if both people are willing to do the work. "Will you testify to what you just told me?" I asked. "Not against your mother, necessarily. Just the truth. That you didn't know. That you saw how I was treated growing up and never said anything." Frank thinks the more complete a picture we can give of what actually happened in that house, the better this goes for everyone who's actually telling the truth. There was a long pause. "Yes," Ashley said finally. "I will." The forensic accountant's report and Frank's formal complaint reached the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office in early August, and the wheels of that particular machine turned faster than any of us expected. Mostly, it turned out, because Gerald Fossick was not a first-time offender. Frank called me on a Wednesday morning with the news, his voice carrying an edge of something that might have been satisfaction, might have been simple relief. "They found 2 other cases," he said. "One in Franklin County from 11 years ago that got him disbarred as a paralegal in the first place. An elderly widow, forged codicil, Nearly identical scheme. Another one, more recent, in Delaware County, currently under investigation, that a detective there had already been building a case around before your complaint came in. Apparently, your father's estate is the third documented instance. The DA's office is treating it as a pattern of elder financial exploitation, and Fossick is looking at multiple felony charges. What about Diane? I asked. And Mark? That's still being determined, Frank said. But I'd expect the DA's office to be very interested in a wire transfer made from an unconscious man's business account, and very interested in whoever hired Fossick to draft the fraudulent will in the first place. I felt something complicated settle over me at that news. Not triumph, exactly, though there was some of that too, buried under the surface. Mostly what I felt was a kind of exhausted clarity, the sense of watching a structure I'd spent 32 years quietly propping up finally, completely, fall down under its own weight, with nothing left for me to do but step back and let it happen. The mediation took place in a conference room, not unlike the one where I'd first heard the fraudulent will read aloud. Beige walls, a long table, a box of tissues placed with grim practicality in the center, as though the mediator, a calm, gray-haired woman named Ruth Alvarez, had learned from long experience that nobody sat down at that table without eventually needing them. Diane was there with Patricia Kwan. Mark was there too, thinner than I remembered him, his hands shaking slightly in a way that told its own story about what the past few months of legal pressure and, I suspected, forced sobriety had done to him. Ashley sat beside me, which surprised Diane visibly when she walked in and saw the seating arrangement, and I felt a small, complicated warmth at having, for the first time in my life, someone from that side of the family choose to sit next to me instead of across from me. I will not walk you through every hour of that mediation. It took nearly 6 hours, with breaks, with Ruth Alvarez's careful, practiced patience smoothing over 3 separate moments where the conversation threatened to collapse into something less productive than negotiation. But I want to tell you about the moment that mattered most, because I think it's the moment this whole story has actually been building toward. Patricia Kwan, on Diane's behalf, proposed a settlement. Diane would formally relinquish all claims to the house and the business, acknowledging the validity of the 2015 will. Mark would agree to a restitution schedule for the funds traced directly to his accounts, alongside mandatory enrollment in a gambling addiction treatment program as a condition of avoiding a recommendation for prosecution. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue additional civil damages beyond what restitution already covered, and to write a letter to the district attorney's office indicating that the family had reached a resolution and that I did not personally wish to see Diane charged criminally, even though the decision ultimately would not be mine to make. Everyone in that room looked at me, waiting. I thought about my father, thin and gray in a hospital bed, recording a message to a daughter who wasn't there because she'd finally, for the first time in 14 months, allowed herself 2 days away to breathe. I thought about the tomato seeds in the Danish cookie tin, and the note that said for Claire, when she's ready to plant something that's actually hers. I thought about 32 years of Sunday phone calls, and church introductions that made the word first sound like a rough draft. And I thought, finally, about what kind of person I wanted to be on the other side of all of this. Not the person who burned the whole family to the ground out of 30 years of accumulated hurt, however justified that hurt might be, but the person my father had actually raised, underneath all the quiet, underneath all the years of not making waves. I'll agree to the settlement, I said, on one condition. Patricia Kwan's pen paused over her legal pad. What condition? Diane doesn't get to keep telling people, at church, at family gatherings, wherever, that I was never really family, I said. I don't need an apology. I don't think she's capable of giving honestly. But I wanted in writing, as part of this agreement, that any public or family statement about the estate acknowledges that the house and business were left to me by my father's actual, legally valid wishes, not given to me out of some contested family dispute, not something I fought my stepmother for out of greed. The truth. That's all I've ever actually wanted out of any of this. Not revenge. Just the truth. Finally, in writing, where nobody can quietly rewrite it again. Ruth Alvarez looked at Diane. Diane, for the first time in that entire 6-hour mediation, looked directly at me, and something passed between us that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite forgiveness, but was, perhaps, the closest either of us was capable of coming to both. Agreed, she said quietly. The criminal side of things moved slower than the civil settlement, the way these things usually do. Gerald Fossick pleaded guilty, eventually, to multiple counts of practicing law without a license and forgery, rolled into a single plea deal that covered all 3 of his known victims, including my father's estate. He was sentenced to 4 years, which felt, to me, like both too much and not nearly enough. Too much for a pathetic, greedy man who had never physically hurt anyone. Not enough for what he'd done to families like mine. Families who trusted a piece of paper with a notary stamp on it to mean something sacred about a dead man's final wishes. Mark's case never went to trial. The district attorney's office, weighing the restitution agreement, the completed intake into a residential gambling treatment program, and, I suspect, though I was never told this directly, a certain reluctance to prosecute a case where the primary victim's own daughter had specifically requested leniency, agreed to a diversion program. 18 months of supervised probation, continued mandatory treatment, full restitution of the funds traced to his accounts, and a permanent condition that he have no financial role whatsoever, ever again, in Bennett Hardware. Diane was never charged. I want to be honest that this bothered me for a long time, in a low, persistent way that would surface at odd moments. Folding laundry, driving to the store, lying awake at 2 a.m, turning the whole situation over like a stone in my hand, looking for a smoother side that never quite appeared. The DA's office ultimately decided that while Diane's actions showed a pattern of concealment and facilitation, the direct forgery and the fraudulent wire transfer were more clearly, more provably, the work of Fossick and Mark specifically, and that pursuing a case against Diane herself would be difficult to win and would drag the whole family through a trial that, frankly, everyone but the prosecutor's own conviction rate seemed to want to avoid. I made my peace with that outcome slowly, the way I've made my peace with most of the hardest things in my life, not all at once, not with any single dramatic realization, but in small, cumulative steps, most of them involving a lot of quiet conversation with James, a good therapist named Dr. Whitmore, who I started seeing twice a month starting that August, and, eventually, my mother's tomato seeds. The store reopened under my ownership on the first Monday of September, 6 months after my father's death, 4 months after the reading of the fraudulent will, and about 6 weeks after the mediation agreement was finalized and notarized by an actual, licensed attorney this time. I didn't change the name. I know some people, hearing this story, might expect me to rebrand entirely, to scrub the place clean of every association with the family that had tried to take it from me, but the sign said, Bennett Hardware and Supply, and it had said that since 1961, since my grandfather hung it up with his own hands, and I wasn't going to let Diane's greed or Mark's addiction or a disbarred paralegal's forgery take that name away from me any more than they'd already tried to take everything else. What I did change was smaller and, I think, more meaningful. I brought back an employee my father had let go 18 months into his illness, during a period when Diane had been quietly steering payroll decisions toward efficiency. A 61-year-old man named Tommy Hale, who had worked the lumber counter for 22 years and who cried, actual tears, standing in the parking lot when I called to offer him his job back with full seniority restored. I renegotiated 3 vendor contracts that Mark had let lapse into bad terms during his brief, disastrous stint as assistant manager. I hired a part-time bookkeeper, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise, in part because I no longer had the bandwidth to run both my accounting practice and the store's books myself, and in part because I had learned, in the most painful way imaginable, exactly what happens when nobody outside the family is watching the numbers closely enough. And in the back corner of the store, near the register, where my father used to keep a small bulletin board covered in faded photographs of company softball teams and employee birthdays going back 3 decades, I added one more photograph. My mother, young and laughing on a beach, the one I'd found in the storage unit. The one where she was pregnant with me and radiant in a way I'd never seen her look in my own memories of her. Customers ask about it sometimes. Tommy Hale, who'd known my mother in the years before I was born, likes to tell them the story of Susan Bennett's tomato garden, the one that used to make the whole street smell sweet every August, and I have come to understand that this, a photograph on a bulletin board, a story an old employee tells strangers over the lumber counter, is its own quiet, powerful kind of justice. My mother had been erased from that kitchen, from that garden, from that whole side of the family's collective memory, the moment Diane tore out the yellow tile with the painted birds. And now, 30 years later, she was back on the wall, in the one place that had always, truly, belonged to her husband and, through him, to me. Ashley and I did not become close overnight. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes rush the reconciliation in a way that does a disservice to how real relationships actually heal, which is slowly, unevenly, with setbacks along the way. We started with coffee, once a month, at a place halfway between Millbrook and Columbus that felt neutral enough for both of us. The first few times were stiff, full of careful small talk, both of us circling around the actual subject we needed to discuss like two people avoiding a hole in the sidewalk they both know is there. It was Ashley, eventually, who broke through it, on our 4th coffee, in October, when the leaves outside the coffee shop window had gone the particular burnt orange that Ohio does so well in autumn. "I used to be jealous of you," she said, apropos of nothing, staring into her cup. "Isn't that insane? You had a dead mother and a stepmom who barely tolerated you, and I was jealous. Because Dad, your dad, I mean, God, I don't even know what to call him anymore. He had this way of looking at you that he never quite had for me or Mark. Like you were the real thing and we were I don't know, the consolation prize that came with the marriage." I didn't know what to say to that, so I let her keep talking, which I was learning, slowly, was often the better choice in hard conversations. "I think that's part of why I never said anything," she continued, "about how Mom treated you. Some small ugly part of me liked that you were the one on the outside for once, instead of me feeling like the daughter who couldn't quite measure up to a dead woman's memory. I'm not proud of that. I've thought about it a lot in therapy this year." "You're in therapy?" I asked, and something in my voice must have carried real surprise, because Ashley laughed, a short, rueful sound. "Everyone in this family should be in therapy, Claire. I'm honestly stunned it took a forged will and a felony investigation to get any of us there." We laughed together at that. Really laughed. The first genuine, unguarded moment between us in 35 years. And something shifted after that afternoon. Some old, calcified wall between us finally starting, slowly, to come down. I saw Diane only twice in the year after the mediation. The first time was at a Rotary Club fundraiser I attended for the store's community outreach, where she was noticeably diminished from the polished, composed woman who had once introduced me at church functions with such careful, cutting precision. She had moved out of the Cedar Lane house, my house now, though I hadn't yet decided whether I wanted to live in it myself or sell it, a decision I was still turning over slowly, the way I turned over most big decisions those days, into a smaller condo on the other side of Millbrook. She had aged, in the way people age quickly when a life built on careful appearances finally collapses. We nodded at each other across the room and did not speak. The second time was at Ashley's wedding, 18 months after my father's death, where I attended as Ashley's guest, not Diane's, a distinction that mattered more to me than I expected it to when the invitation arrived. Diane approached me at the reception, alone, holding a glass of white wine she didn't seem to actually want to drink. "The store looks wonderful," she said. "Tommy told me you brought back the softball photos." "I did," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face, older now, less composed, stripped of 30 years of careful performance, softened into something that might, finally, have been genuine. "I was wrong about you, Claire. I don't know if I ever told you that plainly. I don't know if I'm capable of saying it the way you probably need to hear it. But I was wrong, for 30 years, about what kind of family you were to that man. And I'm sorry. And I understand if that doesn't fix anything." "It doesn't fix anything," I said, and I watched her flinch slightly, and then I continued, more gently than I expected to be able to manage. "But it's something. Thank you for saying it." We didn't hug. We didn't become friends. But we stood together at Ashley's wedding, two women who had spent 3 decades failing to understand each other, and for the first time, I think we both, finally, understood exactly what had happened, and exactly why. And there was a strange, quiet peace in that, even without forgiveness fully arriving behind it. I've told you about the reading of the will, and the storage unit, and the mediation room, but I haven't told you about the funeral itself, and I think, looking back, I avoided it on purpose, the way you avoid touching a bruise, even after the rest of the injury has healed. So let me go back, just for a moment, to March, to the week we buried my father, before any of the rest of this had started to unravel. It was a Tuesday, unseasonably warm for Ohio, the kind of false spring day that tricks the crocuses into coming up early, only for a hard frost to kill them a week later. 200 people came to the funeral home in Millbrook. More than I expected, though I shouldn't have been surprised, because my father had spent 40 years selling nails and lumber and good, patient advice to half the town, and people remember that kind of quiet decency even when they don't remember much else about a person. I gave the eulogy. Not Diane, not Mark, not Ashley, me, because my father had, in one of the few explicit conversations we'd had about his death before he got too sick to have conversations at all, asked me to, months earlier, sitting in his recliner with a blanket over his knees, even though it was July and 85 degrees outside. "You're the one who actually knows how to say things plainly," he'd told me. "Diane will make it sound like a Hallmark card. I need somebody up there telling the truth." I stood in front of 200 people and told the truth, or the version of it I understood at the time, before I knew about the storage unit or the video or any of what was still, mercifully, hidden from me. I talked about a man who hung a sign on a building in 1961 and never once let it come down, even through 2 recessions and the arrival of a big-box hardware store 15 minutes up the highway that should have put him out of business and somehow never quite managed to. I talked about a father who wasn't perfect, who didn't always fight hard enough for the people he loved, but who showed up, every single Sunday for 32 years, on the other end of a phone line, because some love doesn't announce itself loudly. It just keeps calling, week after week, year after year, whether or not anyone notices how consistent it's been. I did not know, standing at that podium, that 6 weeks later I would be sitting in a beige conference room being told I wasn't entitled to any of what that man had built. I did not know about the storage unit, or the video message, or the tomato seeds in the Danish cookie tin. I only knew that I had loved my father, imperfectly and completely, for 32 years, and that some part of me, some old, tired, 12-year-old part of me that had never quite stopped waiting for someone to choose her first, hoped, quietly, almost embarrassed by the hope, that he had loved me back in some way the world would finally be forced to acknowledge. He had. I just didn't know it yet. People who haven't done it don't always understand what caretaking a dying parent actually involves, and I think it's worth telling you plainly, because it matters to understanding why the will mattered so much to me, not the money, particularly, though I won't pretend the money meant nothing, but the acknowledgement of what those 14 months had cost. It looked like driving 2 hours each way, every Friday night, to spend the weekend in a guest room that used to be my childhood bedroom before Diane converted it into a craft room nobody actually used for crafting. It looked like learning to manage 11 different medications on a rotating schedule, setting alarms on my phone at 3 in the morning to make sure my father took the anti-nausea medication before the pain medication, because if you got the order wrong, he'd be sick for hours. It looked like sitting in a chemo infusion room for 6 hours at a stretch, watching poison drip slowly into my father's arm while we watched bad daytime television and pretended, both of us, that this was a normal way to spend a Tuesday. It looked like the insurance company denying a scan his oncologist said was medically necessary, and me spending 6 hours on the phone, transferred between 4 different departments, finally getting a supervisor who agreed to override the denial only after I threatened, calmly, to file a formal complaint with the state insurance commissioner. Diane, who was in the house that entire day, doing what I later learned was quietly moving money through Whitfield's Strategic Solutions, had told me that morning she didn't have the patience for that kind of thing. And at the time, exhausted and grieving in advance for a man who wasn't dead yet, I had simply absorbed that as one more small thing I would have to carry alone. It looked like learning to cook 6 different bland, low-fiber meals that were the only things his stomach could hold down some weeks. Driving to 3 different grocery stores because the specific brand of electrolyte drink he could tolerate kept going out of stock. It looked like holding a bucket while he was sick, and helping him to the bathroom when he was too weak to walk alone, and lying to him, gently, when he asked if he looked as bad as he felt. Because some kindnesses matter more than honesty. It looked like being there, every single week, for 14 months, while my stepbrother visited twice, and my stepmother quietly drained the family business to cover his gambling debts. I tell you all of this not to build a case for myself. The case was already built, by then, in bank statements and forensic accounting reports, and a video message from a hospice bed. I tell you this because I think it matters, for anyone listening who has been the one who shows up, quietly, over and over, while other people get the credit, or the inheritance, or the easier version of the story. What you do in those unglamorous, unwitnessed hours matters, even when it feels like nobody is keeping score. Someone is always keeping score, even if it's only the person you're caring for, even if they don't find the words to say it out loud until it's almost too late. I haven't told you enough about James, and I think that's a disservice, because none of what I've described, the storage unit, the mediation, the calm, steady months of fighting for the truth, would have been survivable without him. And I think stories like this one sometimes forget to give credit to the quiet people standing just outside the frame. James and I met at a friend's 4th of July barbecue when I was 24, both of us hiding from the heat under the same shade tree, Both of us, it turned out, mildly allergic to the friend's overly enthusiastic dog. He sells commercial insurance, which is not, I'll admit, a glamorous profession. But there is something to be said for a man whose entire career is built around carefully reading fine print and anticipating disasters before they happen, because it turns out that's exactly the kind of steady, unflashy competence you need standing beside you when your whole family turns out to be built on a foundation of forged documents. He never once told me to let it go, even in the exhausting middle months when Frank's investigation was dragging, and Diane's attorney kept requesting extensions, and I would come home some nights so tired of the whole thing that I genuinely considered just walking away from the house, the business, all of it, just to be done with the fighting. He never once told me I was being too aggressive, or not aggressive enough, or that I should think of Mark's addiction as a mitigating factor, or that I shouldn't. He just kept showing up, to the lawyer's office, to the mediation, to the quiet Tuesday nights when I sat at the kitchen table going through bank statements until my eyes blurred. The same steady, unglamorous showing up that I had learned, growing up, was the only kind of love that actually meant anything in the end. "You keep thanking me for this," he said to me once, maybe 8 months into the whole ordeal, when I'd apologized, again, for how much of our life together the estate battle had consumed. "You don't have to keep thanking me. This is what marriage is supposed to look like. This is the whole deal, Claire. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm just doing the thing I promised to do 14 years ago in front of your father, who cried, if you'll remember, more than I've ever seen a man cry at a wedding that wasn't his own daughter's, except it was." I did remember. I remember it more clearly now than I did at the time, because I understand, now, in a way, I didn't fully understand at 26. Exactly what it cost my father to walk me down that aisle. A man who had spent 12 years failing to protect me from a house that made me feel like a guest, finally, publicly, unmistakably claiming me as his daughter in front of 200 people. Tears streaming down a face that rarely showed that much feeling in public. I think, in retrospect, that walk down the aisle might have been the loudest thing my father ever did on my behalf, and I only understood its full weight 3 decades later, watching a video of him apologizing from a hospice bed for all the times he hadn't been loud enough. My son Ben was 19 when his grandfather died, a sophomore at Miami University studying mechanical engineering, and I want to tell you about him too, because the way he responded to all of this taught me something I hadn't expected to learn from my own child. Ben adored my father in the specific, uncomplicated way that grandchildren often manage to adore grandparents, unburdened by the decades of complicated history that made my own relationship with him so layered. Robert Bennett taught Ben to use a table saw safely at age 11, over Diane's mild objections, in the same workshop behind the store where he'd once taught me to sand a birdhouse when I was the same age. He drove up to Ben's high school baseball games even during the early months of chemo, sitting in a folding chair in the outfield bleachers in a Buckeyes cap that hid, poorly, how much hair he'd already lost. He called Ben, separately from his calls to me, every couple of weeks, just to talk about engineering, about the Buckeyes, about nothing in particular, the same way he'd called me every Sunday for 32 years. When I told Ben about the fraudulent will, sitting across from him at a diner near his campus because I didn't want him hearing it for the first time over the phone, he went very quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that has stayed with me since. "Grandpa used to tell me that the store's whole reputation was built on one thing," Ben said. He said, "Ben, you can build a business on being cheap, or you can build it on being honest, and only one of those things survives a bad year." I think that's basically what this is about, isn't it? Somebody tried to build a fake version of his last wishes out of being cheap and scared instead of honest. And you're just fixing that. You're making it honest again. I don't know when my son got old enough to say something that clear-eyed and wise, but I suspect it happened gradually, the way most real growth does. In 1,000 small moments I wasn't paying close enough attention to notice individually. Ben ended up spending the following summer working part-time at Bennett Hardware, learning the business from Tommy Hale and from me, and there is something in watching your own child stand behind the same counter where your father once stood, where your grandfather once stood. That makes an inheritance feel like something bigger than a line item on a legal document. It felt, finally, like a legacy being handed forward correctly, the way it was always supposed to happen, before anyone tried to bury it under a forged signature and a UPS store notary stamp. I think it's time I told you more about my mother, because in some ways, this whole story is as much about her as it is about my father. Even though she died 34 years before any of this happened, even though she never met Diane or Mark or Ashley, never saw the yellow tile torn out or the tomato garden replaced with a stone patio. Susan Bennett grew up in a farming family 2 counties over, the youngest of 5 children, the only one who left for college, the only one who came back afterward with a degree in botany she never formally used, but that shaped, I think, almost everything about how she moved through the world. She met my father at a county fair when she was 23, judging a vegetable competition she had no business judging, according to my father, because she disqualified his prize tomatoes on a technicality about growing conditions that he swore, for the rest of his life, was invented on the spot because she thought he was cute, and wanted an excuse to keep arguing with him. They married 18 months later in a small church in Millbrook that no longer exists. It burned down in the 90s and was replaced by a strip mall, a fact that always struck my mother, before she died, as a strange and slightly funny commentary on the passage of time, the kind of quiet, underestimated intelligence my mother had spent her whole short life gently insisting on. She died on a Thursday. I was at school, in 7th grade, and I remember the specific, wrong feeling of being called to the principal's office in the middle of second period, of seeing my father's face through the window before he even opened the door, already knowing, in the animal way, children sometimes know things before anyone says them out loud, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. An aneurysm, the doctor said later. A blood vessel in her brain that had probably been a fragile, ticking thing since birth, waiting for no reason at all to finally give way on an unremarkable Thursday in March, while she stood at the stove, making dinner. I think about her more now than I did in my 20s and 30s, when grief was still sharp enough that thinking about her too directly felt dangerous, like touching a stove I already knew was hot. Now, in my late 40s, running the business her husband spent his whole life building, growing her tomatoes again in a garden I finally planted behind my own house. I think about her constantly, and mostly what I feel isn't grief anymore. It's gratitude for a mother who taught me, even in the short 12 years I had her, that a woman is allowed to know more than people expect her to know, and allowed to prove it quietly, on her own timeline, whenever she's finally ready. I planted my mother's tomato seeds the spring after the mediation, a full year after my father's death, in a strip of earth along the back fence of the house James and I had lived in for 16 years. Not Cedar Lane, which I had ultimately decided to sell, for reasons I'll get to, but our own house, our own yard, 6 raised beds I built myself over a single exhausting, cathartic weekend with Ben home from college to help. I want to tell you honestly that I did not expect 30-year-old seeds to germinate. Frank Whitaker, who fancied himself something of an amateur gardener, had warned me gently that tomato seeds rarely stay viable much past 10 years, that I shouldn't be disappointed if nothing came up at all, that the gesture of planting them mattered more than the outcome. I planted them anyway, in early May, following the careful instructions in my mother's own looping handwriting on the backs of the seed packets. And then I did the thing my mother always said a garden demanded of you. I showed up, every single day, and did the work, regardless of how I felt about the outcome. Cherokee Purple came up first, 7 days later, small green shoots pushing up through soil that had waited 30 years to hold them. Then Mortgage Lifter. Then, more slowly, more reluctantly, Brandywine, the variety my mother had always said was stubborn, like your father. A joke I hadn't understood until I watched those particular seeds take nearly 3 full weeks to finally break the surface. By August, I had tomatoes. Actual, ripe, red tomatoes, growing from seeds my mother had saved and dated in a kitchen that no longer existed, in a garden that had been torn out and replaced with a fountain, in a family that had tried, in 100 small and large ways over 32 years, to make me feel like I didn't quite belong in the story of my own life. I stood in my backyard on a warm August evening, the whole yard smelling green and sweet and alive, the way Cedar Lane used to smell every summer of my childhood. And I picked the first ripe Cherokee Purple, and I ate it standing right there in the dirt, still warm from the sun, and I cried the way I had cried in the storage unit. Not delicately, not quietly, but completely. The specific grief and joy of a woman finally, 34 years later, tasting something her mother had planted for her. James found me out there, tomato juice running down my chin, and he didn't ask what was wrong, because I think, by then, he understood that not everything that makes you cry is actually wrong. He just sat down in the dirt next to me, in his good work slacks that would need dry cleaning afterward. And he ate a tomato too, and we sat there together in the last of the evening light until it got too dark to see the garden anymore. I want to tell you about the decision to sell the Cedar Lane house, because I know some people, hearing a story like this, might expect the ending to involve me moving back into my childhood home in some triumphant reclamation, and that isn't what happened, and I think the reason why matters. I walked through that house alone, one Saturday in the fall after the mediation concluded, empty now, Diane's furniture already moved out to her condo, and I stood in what used to be my mother's kitchen, the marble counters Diane installed still there, the yellow tile with the painted birds still gone, buried under a landfill somewhere for 30 years. And I understood finally, standing in that empty room, that the house wasn't actually the thing I had been fighting for. The house was just wood and drywall and 30 years of complicated memory. What I had been fighting for was the truth, and the truth didn't require me to live inside its physical evidence for the rest of my life. I sold Cedar Lane in October to a young family with 3 kids and a golden retriever who fell in love with the big backyard, the same backyard where my mother's tomato garden used to grow before it became a stone patio with a fountain. I used a portion of the proceeds to fully renovate Bennett Hardware's aging loading dock and warehouse, a project my father had been putting off for a decade because he never had the capital to spare. I put another portion into a scholarship fund at Millbrook High School, in my mother's name, the Susan Bennett Memorial Scholarship for Women in Agricultural and Life Sciences, a small, quiet thing, $5,000 a year to a graduating senior with an interest in botany or horticulture, a way of making sure her name meant something to people who'd never known her, the way it had once meant everything to a house full of tomato plants. She never got the chance to see her own daughter finish growing. I kept enough, alongside the business itself, to make sure Ben's education was fully paid for and that James and I could eventually retire comfortably. But I didn't keep the house. Some inheritances, I came to understand, are better honored by what you build forward with them than by what you preserve exactly as it was left to you. I saw Mark twice during his 18 months of probation and treatment, both times at his request, both times somewhere neutral. A coffee shop, a park bench near the treatment center where he did his outpatient sessions after the residential portion ended. The first time, 6 months into his recovery, he could barely look at me. He apologized in the halting, over-rehearsed way of someone who has practiced an apology in therapy so many times, it started to sound like a script rather than a feeling, and I let him get through it without interrupting, because I understood by then that sometimes people need to say a rehearsed thing before they can find their way to the real one underneath it. I used to resent you, he admitted, near the end of that first conversation, his coffee gone cold and untouched in front of him. Growing up, you had this whole, I don't know, this whole quiet, moral high ground, always doing the right thing, always visiting your dad, always being the responsible one, and I felt like garbage in comparison every single time anyone brought you up. I think some sick part of me actually enjoyed watching Mom cut you out of the will, because it felt like, finally, you were the one on the outside for once, instead of me. I recognized the sentiment. Ashley had told me something almost identical, months earlier, over coffee at the halfway point between our two lives. It struck me, hearing it a second time from a different sibling, that this had perhaps been the real, quiet tragedy sitting underneath 30 years of Diane's careful favoritism. Not just that I had been made to feel like an outsider, but that Mark and Ashley had been raised to measure their own worth against mine instead of simply being allowed to be who they were, and that comparison had curdled, slowly, into something that made all three of us worse to each other than we needed to be. I don't need you to resent yourself into the ground about this, I told him. I need you to actually get better. That's it. That's the whole thing I want from you, Mark. Not guilt. Just get better. Stay better. Don't let your kids, if you ever have them, grow up measuring themselves against somebody else's shadow the way you and Ashley had to measure yourselves against mine. The second time I saw him, a full year later, he looked like a different person. Steadier, clearer-eyed, 6 months into a new job at a lumber distribution company 2 towns over. A job he'd gotten on his own merits, without his mother's help. The first job in his adult life he'd held for longer than 8 months. He thanked me, again, more simply this time, without the rehearsed quality of the first apology, and then he asked if he could come by Bennett Hardware sometime, just to see it. Just to remember what it had felt like as a kid before all of this, back when Diane had first married my father and Mark, and I had briefly tried and failed to build something like a real sibling relationship before Diane's favoritism and my own retreat into silence had poisoned the possibility. I told him yes. He came by on a Tuesday afternoon in June, walked the aisles quietly, ran his hand along the same lumber counter Tommy Hale had worked for 22 years, and left without buying anything. Just needing, I think, to see that some things, the smell of sawdust, the particular light coming through the front windows in the late afternoon, could survive even after everything else had fallen apart and been rebuilt from scratch. Frank Whitaker retired 18 months after the estate was finally settled, closing the converted house law practice on Main Street after 42 years, handing his remaining clients to a younger attorney he'd been mentoring for the past 3 years. He asked me to come by the office one last time before he officially closed the doors, and I found him surrounded by boxes, sorting through 4 decades of case files with the particular, unhurried care of a man closing a chapter. He was genuinely at peace with, rather than one he was being forced to abandon. Your father would have been proud of how you handled all of this, he told me, handing me a small box he'd apparently set aside specifically for this conversation. Not the winning part. Anybody can be satisfied by winning. I mean the part where you insisted on the truth over revenge, in that mediation room. The part where you kept Ashley close instead of pushing her away just because she shared blood with people who wronged you. That's the part he would have recognized as his own daughter, through and through. Inside the box was a small stack of documents, copies of every piece of paperwork Frank had ever drawn up for my father, going back to 1998, alongside a handwritten note in Frank's careful, old-fashioned script. Some families are lucky enough never to need a lawyer this closely involved in their lives. Yours needed me more than most, and I am grateful, in a strange way, that your father trusted me enough to be the one who finally set things right when it mattered most. Take care of that store, Claire. Take care of yourself. You've more than earned both. I keep that note in the top drawer of my father's old desk, the one I still use in the office at Bennett Hardware, and I read it on the hard days. The days when running a small business feels heavier than I expected it to, when I miss my father's steady, unglamorous presence more than I know how to say out loud. The Millbrook Town paper ran a small feature on Bennett Hardware's 65th anniversary the following spring. A modest article, 3 paragraphs, and a photograph, buried on page 6 between a story about the high school's spring musical and an announcement about road construction on Route 40. But it mattered to me more than almost any recognition I'd received in the whole exhausting ordeal of the previous 2 years, because the reporter, a young woman named Katie Sorensen, who'd grown up in Millbrook, and remembered my father from her own childhood trips to the store with her own father, had asked me, near the end of the interview, what I thought made a business, or a family, actually last. I thought about it for a long moment before I answered. Standing behind the same counter where my father had stood for 40 years, where my grandfather had stood before him, where my son now stood some weekends home from college, learning the same trade 3 generations deep. Showing up, I told her. Not the dramatic kind of showing up, the boring kind, the kind nobody claps for. Being there on the Tuesday nobody's watching, not just the big holidays everyone remembers. I think that's true of businesses and it's true of families, and honestly, I think it's the same lesson either way. She printed the quote almost exactly as I'd said it, and I cut the article out and put it in the frame next to my mother's photograph on the bulletin board by the register, where customers still ask about it sometimes, where Tommy Hale still tells the story of Susan Bennett's tomato garden to strangers over the lumber counter, where a small, quiet business in a small, quiet town keeps doing the unglamorous work of simply, steadily, being there. There's a memory I haven't shared yet, one I kept buried for over 30 years, one that surfaced during a therapy session with Dr. Whitmore about 8 months after the mediation, when we were working through what she called the accumulated small griefs, underneath the larger, more dramatic one everyone could see. I was 15. My birthday fell on a Wednesday that year, in early October, and Diane had, for reasons I never fully understood, decided to throw Ashley, whose birthday was 3 days later, an elaborate combined fall birthday celebration that somehow ended up being almost entirely about Ashley. There was a cake with Ashley's name on it in careful pink icing. There were balloons in Ashley's favorite color. There was a table of presents, all wrapped, all addressed to Ashley, and one small unwrapped gift card sitting to the side with my name on a sticky note, as though someone had remembered at the last minute that 2 birthdays were technically being celebrated and had scrambled to make it look intentional. I didn't say anything. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's important to understanding the pattern that would repeat for the next 17 years. I sat at that table, ate a slice of cake with someone else's name on it, and smiled, and thanked Diane for the gift card, and went to my room that night and cried into a pillow so nobody would hear me, because I had already learned, by 15, that making a fuss about being overlooked only ever seemed to confirm, in Diane's mind, that I was the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the daughter who couldn't just be happy for her stepsister. My father wasn't home that night. A late meeting at the store, or so I was told. Though I've wondered since, given everything else I learned, whether Diane had simply timed the party for a night she knew he'd be out, the way people sometimes engineer small cruelties around the absence of the one person who might object. I told Dr. Whitmore that memory, 8 months into our work together, and she asked me a question that stopped me cold. Did you ever tell your father about that birthday? I hadn't. Not that one. Not the dozens of smaller versions of it that followed over the years. I had absorbed each one silently, filed it away, told myself it wasn't worth the fight, and in doing so, I realized, sitting in Dr. Whitmore's office at 46 years old, I had also unknowingly protected Diane from ever having to answer for any of it, one small silence at a time, until 30 years of small silences had built into a woman who genuinely believed she could tell a room full of people that I wasn't real family, because nobody, including me, had ever pushed back hard enough, soon enough, to teach her otherwise. That's not your fault, Dr. Whitmore said gently, watching my face carefully as I worked through it out loud. Children learn very quickly which battles are safe to fight and which ones aren't. You made a reasonable calculation over and over, as a child and then as an adult, that speaking up wasn't safe in that house. What matters now isn't whether you should have spoken up sooner. What matters is that you're speaking up now, and that you're finally letting yourself be angry about a birthday cake with the wrong name on it, 31 years later, because that little girl deserved to have someone notice, and nobody did, and it's allowed to still hurt. I cried in that session the way I'd cried in the storage unit, the way I'd cried in my own backyard eating my mother's tomato. It turns out grief doesn't always arrive on schedule, attached neatly to the biggest, most obvious losses. Sometimes it arrives 30 years late, attached to a birthday cake, waiting patiently for you to finally be ready to feel it. I want to spend a little more time on therapy, because I think it's the part of this story that gets skipped over too quickly in most versions of it. The quiet, unglamorous work that happened in a small office with beige walls, twice a month, for the better part of 2 years, work that mattered just as much as the mediation room and the forensic accounting reports, even though nobody would ever write a dramatic scene about it. Dr. Whitmore taught me, slowly, the difference between the kind of quiet I'd practiced for 32 years, the quiet of a girl who'd learned that speaking up only made things worse, and the kind of quiet I was learning to practice now, in my mid-40s, sitting across from Diane at Cedar Lane, calmly listing bank statements and forgery evidence without raising my voice once. The first kind of quiet, she helped me understand, was a survival strategy, a reasonable adaptation to a house where the girl who made waves got quietly punished for it, while the girl who kept her head down got, if not love, at least the absence of active harm. The second kind of quiet, the kind I was learning now, was something closer to power. The specific, hard-won power of a person who no longer needs to raise her voice, because she has already done the work of gathering the truth. And the truth, laid out calmly and completely, tends to speak plenty loudly on its own. You spent 3 decades being underestimated, Dr. Whitmore told me once, near the end of our work together, when I mentioned, almost offhand, how strange it still felt sometimes to be the person other people in the family now deferred to. Underestimation is exhausting, but it also teaches you things the people underestimating you never bother to learn themselves. You know how to watch closely. You know how to wait. You know how to gather evidence quietly instead of announcing your suspicions before you're ready to act on them. Those aren't small skills, Claire. Those are the exact skills that let you win a fight. Most people in your position wouldn't have survived at all. I think about that a lot now, running Bennett Hardware, raising a son who's about to graduate into a world that will, inevitably, sometimes underestimate him too, married to a man who never once needed me to be loud to know exactly how strong I actually was. Being the quiet one in a family isn't a weakness. It's a particular kind of training, whether anyone means it to be or not, and the people who mistake your quiet for surrender are usually the ones who end up most surprised when you finally, calmly, prove otherwise. The first Christmas after my father's death was the hardest, harder even than the funeral itself, because funerals come with a kind of structure, a schedule, a script, people telling you exactly what to do and when, while a holiday just arrives on the calendar the way it always has, indifferent to the fact that one of the two people who used to make it feel like Christmas is gone. I didn't go to Cedar Lane that year, obviously. The mediation was still months away, the relationship with Diane still raw and unresolved. Ben came home from college, and James's parents came up from Cincinnati, and we tried, in the careful, deliberate way grieving families try, to build a holiday that felt like something other than a whole shaped exactly like the person missing from it. I made my father's favorite dish, a simple beef stew he'd learned from his own mother, nothing fancy, the kind of food that tastes like a specific kitchen even when you make it in a different one. And I set a place at the table for him anyway, an old tradition from my mother's family that I'd forgotten about until that exact moment, when some instinct older than conscious memory made me reach for a sixth plate before I even understood why. James didn't ask about the extra place setting. Ben, when he noticed it, just quietly reached over and put his hand on the back of the empty chair for a moment before sitting down, a small, wordless gesture that told me my son understood, better than I'd expected a 19-year-old to understand, exactly what that empty chair meant. We got through it. That's the honest truth of that first Christmas. We didn't have some beautiful, cathartic breakthrough. We didn't find closure wrapped up with a bow. We just got through it. One course of beef stew and one quiet toast to my father's memory at a time. And I've come to understand, since then, that getting through the first version of a hard thing is its own kind of accomplishment, even when it doesn't feel like one in the moment. The second Christmas was easier. The third, easier still. By this most recent one, 4 years out now, the empty chair had become less an open wound and more a quiet, familiar tradition. A place setting for my father, a smaller one beside it now for my mother too. 2 chairs at a table that will always, in some small way, be set for people who can't sit in them anymore, but whose absence has finally, slowly, softened into something closer to presence than loss. Ben graduated from Miami University 2 years after his grandfather's death, magna cum laude, mechanical engineering, a job offer already lined up with a manufacturing firm in Dayton before he even walked across the stage. I sat in the stadium with James, and my sister-in-law by relationship rather than blood, Ashley, who had asked, tentatively, if she could come, a request that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier and now felt like the most natural thing in the world. I thought about my father the entire ceremony, not in the sharp, sudden way grief sometimes ambushes you, but in a softer, steadier way, the way you think about someone whose absence has become woven into the fabric of a happy day rather than sitting on top of it like a shadow. He would have driven up for this, I knew, the way he'd driven up for every baseball game, every school event, every small milestone in Ben's life, sitting in the stands in his Buckeyes cap, probably embarrassing Ben slightly with how loudly he cheered when they called his name. Instead, I stood up and cheered loudly enough for both of us when Ben's name was called, loud enough that James laughed and told me afterward I'd sounded exactly like my father used to sound at those baseball games, a comparison that made me cry, right there in the stadium parking lot, in the good, cleansing way that grief sometimes finally allows once enough time has passed. Ben came over after the ceremony, still in his cap and gown, and handed me something small wrapped in tissue paper. A gift, he said, that he'd been saving for exactly this moment. Inside was a small brass nameplate, the kind you'd put on an office desk, engraved with my name, Claire Bennett, owner. Grandpa always kept one like this on his desk, Ben said. I found the company that made the original one for him back in the 80s. I thought you should have your own. I keep it on my desk at Bennett Hardware now, next to Frank Whitaker's handwritten note in the top drawer, next to a photograph of my mother laughing on a beach 30 years before I was born. By the 4th year of my ownership, Bennett Hardware had grown in ways my father, for all his steady, careful stewardship, had never quite managed. I added a small landscaping and garden supply section, tomato seedlings every spring, a section my mother, I think, would have particularly appreciated, that became, unexpectedly, one of our most profitable departments. I hired 6 new employees, including 2 Millbrook High School graduates who'd gone through the Susan Bennett Memorial Scholarship Program and came back, after college, wanting to work somewhere that had, in a strange and roundabout way, helped fund their education. Tommy Hale retired at 65, 3 years after I brought him back, with a full pension and a retirement party that filled the store's parking lot with more people than I'd seen at my father's funeral, which felt, somehow, like exactly the right kind of tribute. Not to my father directly, but to the whole culture of decency and showing up that he'd built into that business over 40 years, a culture that had survived even the worst betrayal his own family could throw at it. Denise, the bookkeeper I'd hired in that first difficult year, eventually became the store's full-time general manager, freeing me up to finally, properly retire from my own accounting practice and focus entirely on Bennett Hardware, a decision that would have seemed impossible to me 5 years earlier, back when I was a woman whose stepmother had just told a room full of people that she wasn't real family. I renamed the loading dock after my father, a small brass plaque, Robert Bennett Loading Dock, EST. 1961, renovated 2027 $. And I renamed the garden section after my mother, a hand-painted wooden sign that read, Susan's Corner, above rows of tomato seedlings and heirloom seed packets. A small, permanent acknowledgement of the 2 people whose love, however imperfectly expressed, however long it took the world to properly recognize it, had built everything I now stood behind. I want to tell you about something that happened about 3 years after the mediation, because I think it captures, better than almost anything else I could tell you, what this whole ordeal ultimately taught me, and why I think stories like this one matter to the people who watch them. A woman came into the store on a slow Tuesday afternoon, mid-50s, buying supplies for a small home repair project, and something about the careful, exhausted way she carried herself caught my attention while I rang her up at the register. A look I recognized, though it took me a moment to place why. It was the look of someone who has spent a long time being underestimated by the people who were supposed to love her best. We got to talking, the way strangers sometimes do over a register when there's nobody else in line and no reason to rush. Her name was Patricia, and she mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she was doing the repair project herself because her late husband's family had recently, unexpectedly, contested his will, and she was trying to keep the house he'd left her in good condition while the whole matter worked its way through probate court. I didn't tell her my whole story. Not there, not over a register with a line starting to form behind her, but I told her a small piece of it. Enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Enough to give her Frank's successor's number in case she needed an attorney who understood exactly this kind of quiet, devastating family betrayal. Enough to tell her the one thing I most wished someone had told me during those first exhausting weeks after the reading of the fraudulent will. Being calm doesn't mean you're not fighting, I told her. Sometimes the calmest person in the room is the one about to win. She looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind her tired eyes, and then she thanked me, paid for her supplies, and left. I don't know how her story ended. I like to imagine it ended the way mine did. Not with revenge, exactly. Not with anger finally getting its due, but with the truth, laid out calmly and completely, doing the quiet, patient work that truth eventually always does, if you're willing to gather it carefully enough and wait long enough for the right moment to lay it on the table. I want to tell you one more thing about Diane before I close this story, because I think it would be dishonest to leave her as a flat villain in a tale that has otherwise tried, throughout, to hold complicated people in complicated light. I learned years later through a conversation with Ashley over one of our now regular monthly coffees that Diane's first marriage, to Mark and Ashley's biological father, had ended when he left her, abruptly, for a much younger woman, taking with him nearly all of the couple's savings through a series of financial maneuvers Diane hadn't understood until it was too late to stop them. She had been 34 at the time, with a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, and she had rebuilt her entire life from something close to nothing, working 2 jobs for years before she met my father, before the county fair story, before any of what I'd grown up believing was simply Diane's natural, effortless polish. She was terrified of losing everything again, Ashley told me. That's not an excuse for what she did to you, Claire. I want to be clear about that. But I've thought about this a lot in therapy. I think some of the way she clung to material things, to appearances, to making sure her kids were always taken care of even when it meant hurting someone else's kid, came from watching her whole life get taken away once already and deciding, somewhere deep down, that she would never let it happen again, no matter the cost to anyone else. I don't offer this as an excuse. I want to be very clear about that, the same way Ashley was clear about it. What Diane did, forging a dying man's final wishes, letting a disbarred paralegal produce a fraudulent legal document, draining a family business while my father lay unconscious in a hospice bed, was not a forgivable act, simply because it grew out of an earlier wound. People who have been hurt do not get an automatic pass to hurt other people in turn. If anything, I think, having been hurt myself in smaller, quieter ways for 3 decades, I understand better than most how important it is not to let your own old wounds justify new cruelty. But understanding isn't the same as excusing, and I found, in the years after the mediation, that understanding Diane's fear, really understanding it, the way you understand a stranger's whole complicated life story rather than the flattened villain version you've been carrying around in your head, made it possible for me to finally, fully, put the whole ordeal down. Not to forgive her exactly. I'm still not sure I've done that. 4 years later, and I've made a kind of peace with the possibility that I might never fully get there. But to stop carrying her, at least. To stop letting the woman who once tore out my mother's kitchen tile take up any more space in my head than she'd already taken for 32 years. Bennett Hardware celebrated its 70th anniversary this past spring, and I stood behind the same counter where my father and grandfather stood before me, in the store that survived a forged will, a disbarred paralegal, a stepbrother's gambling addiction, and 32 years of a stepmother's careful, cutting favoritism, and I thought, more than anything else, about how strange and quiet the actual arc of justice turned out to be. I had expected, in the raw, furious weeks right after that first reading of the fraudulent will, that justice, if it ever came, would feel like triumph. Like standing over the wreckage of the people who'd wronged me, vindicated, victorious, finally proven right in front of everyone who'd ever doubted me. That isn't what it felt like at all. It felt like a garden, mostly, slow, unglamorous, requiring you to show up every single day and do the quiet work regardless of how you felt about the outcome on any given morning. It felt like a phone call with Ashley that started stiff and ended in real laughter. It felt like a bank statement, carefully photographed, that told a true story nobody wanted to hear. It felt like a video message from a hospice bed, a man too weak to sit upright, finding just enough strength to finally, fully, claim his daughter as the family she had always actually been. Diane still lives in her condo on the other side of Millbrook. We see each other occasionally, at Ashley's family gatherings now that Ashley has a daughter of her own, a little girl named Susan. A choice Ashley made deliberately, she told me, tearfully, the day her daughter was born. Because somebody in this family should carry that name forward the right way this time. Mark is 3 years into a stable job, sober, engaged to a woman he met at a support group meeting who, from what I've seen, seems to genuinely, steadily love him for who he's become rather than who he used to be. Frank Whitaker still comes by the store some Saturdays, retired but unable to fully stay away, and buys more lumber than a man his age has any real reason to need. And I suspect it's less about the lumber and more about the smell of sawdust and the particular comfort of a place that reminds him of a friend he spent 35 years representing well. And I am finally at 46 years old. No, I realize I should say 51 now, 5 years further along than where this story began. The woman my mother's botany degree in its hallway frame always quietly insisted I could become. A woman who knows more than people expect her to know, who proved it calmly, on her own timeline, exactly when she was finally ready. There's a memory I want to share before I close this out. One that doesn't fit neatly into the legal drama of the will contest, but that I think matters more than almost anything else I've told you, because it's the memory that made me understand, finally, what my father had actually been trying to protect all along. When Ben was 8 years old, my father took him behind the register at Bennett Hardware on a slow Saturday afternoon and taught him to count a till, the same way he'd taught me 30-some years earlier. Carefully, patiently, counting out the 20s first, then the 10s, then the 5s, then the 1s, stacking each denomination in careful piles before running the tape and checking it twice against the register's own total. I stood in the doorway of the office and watched them, my father's weathered hands guiding my son's small ones, and I felt something settle in my chest that I didn't have words for at the time. Grandpa says counting money teaches you to pay attention to what's actually there, Ben told me in the car afterward, proud of the $2 in quarters my father had let him keep for his trouble. Not what you think should be there. What's actually there? I didn't think much of it at the time, just a grandfather's small, sweet lesson to a grandson, the kind of thing that happens in 1,000 family businesses across the country every Saturday afternoon. But I thought about it constantly during the 8 months I spent going through Bennett Hardware's books after my father's death, counting out discrepancies the same careful way he'd once taught an 8-year-old to count a till, not what should be there, not what I hoped or feared might be there, just what actually was, stacked in careful piles, checked twice against the truth. I think, in a strange way, my father had been training me my whole life for exactly the fight I eventually had to have, without either of us understanding, at the time, what that training would eventually be for. Every Saturday afternoon behind that register, every careful lesson about paying attention to what's actually there instead of what you wish were there, had been building, slowly, toward a woman capable of sitting in a mediation room 5 years later and laying out a truth nobody wanted to hear, calmly, completely, without a single number out of place. I mentioned the Susan Bennett Memorial Scholarship earlier, but I want to tell you about the girls who've actually received it, because I think their stories matter as much as my own, and because my mother, I believe, would have cared more about them than about anything else in this whole long, complicated ordeal. The first recipient, in the scholarship's inaugural year, was a girl named Priya Chen, the daughter of Millbrook's only pediatrician, who used the funds to study horticultural science at Ohio State. My own alma mater, a coincidence that felt, when I learned about it, like something closer to a message than a coincidence. Priya came by the store the summer before she left for college, nervous and formal, to thank me in person, and ended up staying for 2 hours, talking about soil composition and heirloom seed preservation with an enthusiasm that reminded me, powerfully, painfully, sweetly, of a woman I'd lost when I was 12 years old and had spent the rest of my life slowly learning how to properly remember. The second recipient, a quieter girl named Destiny Walsh, wrote me a letter the following spring that I still keep in the same desk drawer as Frank Whitaker's note. She'd grown up, she wrote, in a blended family not entirely unlike my own, a stepfather's household where she sometimes felt, in her own words, like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. And she'd found the scholarship's description when her guidance counselor showed it to her. Strangely, powerfully validating, simply because someone had bothered to name a scholarship after a woman whose own family history, based on the small blurb I'd included about my mother's love of gardening, sounded like it understood exactly what Destiny had been carrying quietly for years. I didn't set out, when I established that scholarship, to build a small network of girls who recognized something of their own quiet struggles in my mother's story. But it happened anyway, year after year. 5 recipients now and counting, each one a small, unexpected extension of a legacy that had once nearly been erased entirely. A kitchen tile torn out, a garden replaced with a fountain, a name that Diane, for 32 years, had rarely bothered to say out loud at all. There's a conversation I had with James about a year after the mediation concluded that I think belongs in this story, even though it doesn't involve Diane or Mark or Ashley or any of the legal drama at all. We were lying in bed, late, the house quiet, Ben back at college, and I asked him something that had been sitting in my chest for months without quite finding its way into words. "Do you think I handled it right?" I asked. "The whole thing. Not agreeing to the settlement. I know that part was right. I mean the smaller choices. Keeping Ashley close. Not pushing for Mark's prosecution. Letting Diane off easier than she probably deserved, in some strict accounting of what was fair." James was quiet for a long moment, the particular quiet of a man who takes a question seriously enough not to answer it too quickly. "I think," he said finally, "you handled it the way your dad would have wanted, which isn't quite the same question as whether you handled it the way that felt best in the moment, or even the way that was most strictly, legally fair. You could have gone scorched earth. You had the evidence to. Nobody would have blamed you. But I don't think that's who you actually are, underneath everything Diane spent 30 years trying to convince you that you were. I think you're the person who sits with a dying man for 14 months, not because you're keeping score, but because that's just who you are when nobody's watching. And I think you handled the will contest exactly the same way. Not because you're weak, or because you let people off too easy, but because that consistency, that same quiet decency whether or not anybody's keeping score, is exactly the thing your dad recognized in you and never fully found in anyone else in that house. I cried again that night, a smaller, quieter version of all the other times I'd cried throughout this whole ordeal, the storage unit and the backyard tomato and the therapy session about a 31-year-old birthday cake. This time it wasn't grief, exactly, or even relief. It was something closer to recognition, the particular, hard-won relief of finally, fully, being seen by the person who mattered most, for exactly who you'd actually been all along, underneath 30 years of other people's careful, cutting attempts to convince you otherwise. I want to tell you one more story before I close this out because I think it circles back, in an unexpected way, to where this whole thing began. Denise, the bookkeeper I hired in that difficult first year, mentioned to me once over a slow Tuesday lunch in the break room that she'd taken the job partly because of something she'd read about the estate dispute in the Millbrook paper. Not the anniversary feature, but a smaller item, buried in the local court records section, about a probate challenge finally being resolved. She'd been going through her own quiet family struggle at the time, she told me. An aging mother with early dementia, and two siblings who seemed more interested in the house's eventual sale value than in their mother's actual care, and reading about a woman who'd fought quietly, carefully, with evidence instead of anger. For the truth in her own family's estate had given her, in her words, something to hold on to during a period when I felt like I was losing my mind. I applied for the bookkeeping job because I liked the way the article described you, she told me. Calm, thorough, not interested in drama, just interested in getting the numbers right. I thought, if I worked for a business run by a woman like that, maybe some of it would rub off on me during my own mess with my mom's estate. I hadn't known, hiring Denise, that I'd been, in some small way, a kind of quiet inspiration to a stranger going through her own version of exactly what I'd survived. It struck me, hearing her story, that this might be the truest, most unexpected form the whole ordeal's eventual justice had taken. Not the mediation agreement, not the criminal conviction, not even the store's steady 70-year survival, but this. A woman in a break room telling me 5 years later that watching someone else insist calmly on the truth had given her the courage to do the same thing in her own family, during her own quiet, unglamorous fight for what was right. There's a question I never got to ask my father, one that surfaced only after I'd watched his hospice video a dozen times, after I'd read his handwritten letter until the folds started to soften and tear, after the mediation and the criminal proceedings and the slow, patient work of rebuilding a business and a family from the wreckage of a forged will. The question was simple, in the end, and I think about it more than almost anything else from this whole ordeal. Why did he wait? He'd known, according to his own letter, about the consulting payments for at least a year before he died. He'd suspected, based on the careful dates he'd listed, that something was wrong with the store's books even earlier than that. He'd gone to Frank, confirmed that the 2015 will still stood, still protected me, and then he'd simply waited, sick and scared and running out of time, instead of confronting Diane directly, instead of changing the locks on the storage unit, instead of doing any of the more decisive things a healthier, less frightened man might have done. I asked Dr. Whitmore about this once, turning the question over out loud in one of our sessions, and she offered something that has stayed with me since. Dying people often make different calculations than the rest of us, she said. Your father wasn't just protecting the will. He was trying, I think, to protect the last months of his marriage from becoming a battlefield, to protect Mark from an addiction he probably still hoped, right up until the end, might resolve itself without a full public reckoning, to protect you, even, from having to fight this battle while he was still alive to feel guilty about not fighting it himself. Waiting wasn't necessarily weakness, Claire. Sometimes it's a dying man trying to manage an impossible number of competing loves and fears with almost no time or strength left to do it properly, and choosing, imperfectly, to leave the hardest parts of the fight to the daughter he trusted most to eventually finish it. I've made a kind of peace with that answer, though I won't pretend it fully satisfies the part of me that sometimes still wishes he'd simply sat Diane down himself, months earlier, and demanded the truth directly instead of leaving a video message and a storage unit key for me to find after he was already gone. But I understand, better now than I did in the raw early months of this ordeal, that dying people are not always capable of the decisive clarity we wish they'd have in their final months, and that leaving me the evidence, the truth, and his explicit blessing to finish the fight was, in its own imperfect way, its own final act of love and trust, an inheritance of responsibility as much as an inheritance of property. One my father clearly believed, correctly, that I was strong enough to carry. About 2 years after the mediation, In a period when I was doing a lot of the slower, quieter work of processing everything that had happened, Dr. Whitmore suggested I try writing a letter to my father. Not to send anywhere, obviously, just an exercise. A way of saying the things I hadn't gotten to say before he died, or in the confused, grief-stricken weeks immediately afterward. I resisted the idea for weeks, telling her it felt performative, unnecessary, the kind of therapy homework that works better in movies than in real life. Eventually, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, a Sunday, of course, the day that had belonged to us for 32 years, I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote it anyway. I told him about the storage unit and how I'd cried on an overturned milk crate holding my mother's tomato seeds. I told him about the mediation room, about laying the truth out calmly the way he'd apparently always known, better than I knew myself, that I was capable of doing. I told him about Ben counting a till, about Ashley's daughter named Susan, about the brass plaque on the loading dock, and the hand-painted sign above the tomato seedlings. I told him I understood now why he'd waited, even if some small part of me still wished he hadn't had to. And at the end, I told him the thing I most needed him to know, the thing I hadn't fully understood how to say out loud until I'd spent 2 years fighting to prove it in a court of law, that I had never once doubted, not for a single Sunday phone call in 32 years, that he loved me. That the version of him Diane had tried to write into a fraudulent will, a man who'd cut his own daughter out of his life's work in favor of the family that had built a life there together, was never, for one single day, the man I actually knew. That the real inheritance, the one that mattered more than the house or the business or the $210,000 in various accounts, had already been fully paid, in installments, every Sunday, for 32 consecutive years. I never sent that letter, obviously. There was nowhere to send it. But I kept it, folded into quarters, in the same desk drawer as Frank's note and my mother's seed packet instructions, a small private monument to a conversation my father and I never quite managed to have out loud while he was alive, finally, belatedly, completed on paper instead. I think, if I could go back and sit with the 15-year-old girl at that birthday party, the one eating cake with someone else's name on it, smiling politely, absorbing one more small cruelty without saying a word. I know exactly what I'd tell her now. 5 years, and one long, exhausting inheritance battle later. I'd tell her that the silence she was choosing wasn't weakness, even though it would take her another 30 years to fully understand that. I'd tell her that every slight she was quietly filing away, every photograph that didn't make the wall, every dinner thrown for someone else, was building, slowly and invisibly, into a woman capable of sitting calmly across from the person who'd hurt her most and demanding, without raising her voice once, the plain and total truth. I'd tell her that her father loved her more than his own fear allowed him to prove, for most of both their lives, and that the proof would eventually come anyway, in a hospice video and a storage unit, and a manila envelope with her name written across the front in his careful block handwriting. Mostly, though, I'd tell her what I now believe, more fully than I've believed almost anything else in my life. That the family you're born into and the family you eventually prove yourself worthy of protecting aren't always the same shape, and that the second kind, the store, the town, the customers who still ask about the photograph on the bulletin board, the scholarship recipients who write letters about feeling like guests in their own homes, the son who found a brass nameplate to match his grandfather's, the stepsister who finally, slowly, chose to sit beside her instead of across from her, matters just as much. In the end, as the family she was told, for 32 years, she'd never really belonged to at all. That 15-year-old girl grew up to be fine, better than fine. She grew up to plant a garden that actually bloomed, 30 years late, warm from the sun, exactly when she was finally ready to taste it. I should tell you a little more about Marcus Reed, the young attorney Frank Whitaker mentored for 3 years before handing him the practice, because Marcus became, in his own quieter way, an important part of the story's final chapters, even though he arrived on the scene only after the biggest fights were already won. Marcus was 31 when he took over the Main Street practice, sharp and a little too eager in the way young lawyers sometimes are before life has had the chance to sand down their edges, but he had a quality I recognized immediately and trusted because of it. He listened more than he talked. He handled the final paperwork on the Susan Bennett Memorial Scholarship's legal structure, the transfer of Cedar Lane's sale proceeds, the updated will I finally wrote for myself once all the dust from my father's estate had settled. Because if this whole ordeal taught me anything, it was that a person should never leave the people they love without an unambiguous, properly witnessed, professionally notarized record of exactly what they intend. I want 3 copies, I told Marcus, sitting across from him in the same office where Frank had once sat me down, 30-some years earlier, to help my grieving father sort out my mother's modest estate. One with you, one with Frank, even though he's retired, because I trust that man's judgment more than I trust most banks. And one in a safe deposit box that James and Ben both have access to, with clear instructions about where to find it, so nobody in my family ever has to find their inheritance in a storage unit because someone was too scared or too sick to hand it over properly while they still could. Marcus smiled at that, understanding, without my needing to explain further, exactly what I was protecting against. Your father would be glad you're doing this, he said. Frank told me the whole story, in as much detail as client confidentiality allowed. He said you were the kind of client who turns a tragedy into a lesson instead of just a wound. I've thought about that phrase often since, turning a tragedy into a lesson instead of just a wound. I think it's the closest anyone has come to summarizing what I actually did with the 5 years since my father died, and I think it's the thing I most hope this story manages to pass along to whoever needs it. Not just the satisfaction of watching a fraudulent will get overturned, but the quieter, more useful lesson underneath it, about documentation, about communication, about not letting silence and avoidance and the fear of hard conversations create the kind of vacuum that people like Diane, in her most desperate moments, learn to fill with forged signatures and a UPS store notary stamp. Mark got married the spring of the 5th year to the woman he'd met at his support group meeting. Her name was Renata, a steady, plain-spoken accountant of all things, which struck me as a small, strange kind of poetic justice when I first learned her profession, given how much of this whole story had hinged on careful, patient number crunching. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that hesitation, because I think it matters to the shape of this story's ending. Forgiveness and reconciliation, even when they eventually arrive, rarely arrive as cleanly or as completely as we might wish. And I spent a full week debating with James and with Dr. Whitmore whether attending Mark's wedding was a genuine act of healing or simply a performance of healing I felt pressured to give, because enough time had passed that everyone expected it of me. In the end, I went because Ashley asked me to, gently, over one of our coffees, and because some quieter, more honest part of me recognized that Mark's recovery, genuine, hard-won, 3 years sober and counting, deserved acknowledgement separate from whatever complicated feelings I still carried about the worst period of his life. I sat at a table with James and Ashley and her husband and their daughter Susan, and I watched Mark say his vows with a clear-eyed steadiness I'd never once seen in him during all the years I'd known him as a teenager and then a struggling, addicted adult. And I felt something that wasn't quite forgiveness but was, perhaps, its close and equally valuable cousin, Genuine happiness for someone who had done the hard, unglamorous work of actually becoming better. Diane was there too, of course, mother of the groom, and at one point during the reception she caught my eye across the room and raised her glass slightly. A small, wordless acknowledgement that asked for nothing and offered nothing beyond simple recognition that we were both, still, somehow, part of the same complicated, imperfect family. I raised my glass back. It felt like enough. I've been telling you this whole time about what my father left behind in the legal sense. The house, eventually sold and reinvested into a scholarship and a loading dock renovation. The business, still standing after 70 years. The $210,000 that mostly went toward Ben's education and a comfortable, eventual retirement for James and me. But I want to close this story by telling you what I actually think my father left behind, in the truer, less measurable sense, because I think it's the part of this whole ordeal that matters most. He left behind a habit of showing up that I now see reflected in my own son, who drives 4 hours some weekends just to help me with inventory at the store. Not because I need the help, particularly, but because some inherited instinct in him understands, the same way it took me 32 years to understand, that showing up unglamorously and consistently is its own quiet, powerful form of love. He left behind a business that still, 70 years later, treats its employees like Tommy Hale deserved to be treated, with loyalty, with fairness, with a retirement pension that a big box store 15 minutes up the highway would never have bothered to offer. He left behind a daughter who learned, the hard way, at 46 years old, that being the quiet one in a room doesn't mean you're the weakest one, and who has spent the years since trying to pass that lesson forward to 5 college scholarship recipients, to a bookkeeper named Denise who found unexpected courage in a small local newspaper article, to a stranger named Patricia at a hardware store register on a slow Tuesday afternoon, to anyone else who might, someday, need to hear that the calmest person in the room is sometimes the one about to win. And he left behind, finally, a garden, not the physical one at Cedar Lane, torn out decades ago and replaced with a stone fountain that some other family probably doesn't think twice about anymore, but the one that grew, 30 years late, in my own backyard, from seeds a dying man had the foresight to save in a Danish cookie tin, because some part of him always knew, even in the confused, frightened years of his second marriage, that his daughter would eventually be ready to plant something that was actually, unmistakably, hers. That's the inheritance that mattered most. The house was just proof of it, in the end. Proof that could be forged, disputed, fought over in a mediation room with a box of tissues placed carefully in the center of the table. The love underneath it, the 32 years of Sunday phone calls, the tomato seeds saved and dated in a mother's looping handwriting, the quiet, patient habit of showing up. That was never something anyone could have taken from me, no matter what any fraudulent document said. It was already, fully, unmistakably mine, long before a lawyer's office in Ohio ever tried to convince me otherwise. There's a detail I've left out of this story until now, mostly because I wasn't sure, for a long time, how to talk about it without sounding like I was reaching for a tidier ending than the messy, complicated truth actually deserved. But I think it belongs here, near the close, because I think it says something true about how grief and justice actually intersect in a person's life, rather than how they intersect in the neat, satisfying arc of a story told after the fact. About 6 months after the mediation concluded, I had a dream about my father. Not a symbolic, meaningful dream, the kind therapists like to unpack, but a strange, mundane one, the kind that feels almost embarrassingly ordinary when you try to describe it to someone else afterward. In the dream, we were just standing behind the counter at Bennett Hardware on an unremarkable Tuesday, restocking a shelf of wood screws, not talking about anything important, the store empty, the light coming through the front windows, the particular gold color it turns in late September. "You did good, kiddo," he said, not looking up from the screws, in the same brisk, unsentimental tone he'd used for most of the practical instructions of my childhood. "I always knew you would." That was it. No dramatic reconciliation, no tearful goodbye, no final wisdom delivered with cinematic weight. Just a father and daughter restocking a shelf together, the way we'd done 100 ordinary Saturdays throughout my childhood, before any of the complicated grief and legal drama that would eventually define so much of our story together. I woke up crying, the good kind of crying, and I lay in bed next to James for a long time afterward, not saying anything, just letting the strange, ordinary comfort of that dream settle into my chest. I don't believe, in any literal sense, that my father visited me from beyond some veil to deliver a message. I'm not a particularly mystical person, and grief, I've learned, has its own logic that doesn't always require supernatural explanation. But I do believe that some part of my own mind, working through 5 years of trauma and vindication and slow, patient healing, finally needed to imagine my father proud of me in the most unremarkable, everyday way possible. Not because I'd won a legal battle, not because I'd overturned a fraudulent will, but simply because I'd shown up, the way he'd shown up for 40 years behind that same counter, one ordinary Tuesday at a time. Ben doesn't have children yet. He's 24 now, focused on his engineering career, not in any rush toward marriage or family, and I've never once pushed him toward either. But I think about it sometimes, what I'd want him to understand about all of this. Someday, when he's ready to build a family of his own. I want him to know that inheritance isn't really about money, even though money matters. Even though I fought hard for what my father actually intended and don't regret a single hour of that fight. I want him to know that the real inheritance is the habit you build, generation after generation, of showing up for people even when nobody's keeping score, of telling the truth even when it's easier not to, of protecting the people you love, not through grand, dramatic gestures, but through small, consistent, unglamorous acts of care, repeated so many times they eventually become the whole shape of a life. I want him to know that if he ever finds himself in a room being told he isn't real family, whatever form that room might take, whatever shape that cruelty might eventually wear, he should remember that being underestimated is not the same as being wrong, and that the truth, gathered carefully and laid out calmly, tends to win in the end, even when it takes years, even when it costs more than anyone should reasonably have to pay just to be recognized for who they actually are. And I want him to know about the tomato seeds, about his great-grandmother's looping handwriting on the backs of 30-year-old seed packets, about the Danish cookie tin, about the specific stubborn miracle of Brandywine tomatoes taking 3 weeks to finally break the surface of soil that had waited 3 decades to hold them. I want him to understand that some inheritances take a long time to come up, and that the waiting doesn't mean the seeds were never viable. It just means the ground wasn't ready yet, and that readiness, when it finally arrives, is worth every single year of patient, faithful tending it took to get there. Whenever I've shared pieces of this story, with Patricia at the register, with Denise over lunch, with a cousin at a family reunion who'd heard a vague, secondhand version of the whole ordeal, the same question tends to come up eventually, sometimes asked directly, sometimes only hovering, unspoken, behind someone's careful phrasing. Was it worth it? Was fighting for the money, the house, the business, actually worth 2 years of legal battles and a permanently altered relationship with the family that raised me? I understand the question, and I want to answer it honestly, because I think the honest answer is more useful than the tidy, inspirational version some people expect. Financially, yes. Unambiguously, Bennett hardware alone was worth more than most people earn in a decade of ordinary work. And I would be lying if I pretended the money didn't matter. Didn't ease very real anxieties about Ben's education, about James's and my own eventual retirement, about the comfortable, secure life we've been able to build in the years since. Anyone who tells you money doesn't matter in these situations either has more of it than they're admitting to, or hasn't yet had to sit across a table from an insurance company fighting for a scan their dying father needed. But if you're asking whether the money was the actual reason I fought, whether I would have pursued the truth with the same determination if my father's estate had consisted of nothing but sentimental value and a modest life insurance policy, I think the honest answer is that I would have, and that the money, while real and significant and gratefully received, was never actually the center of what I was fighting for. I was fighting for the plain, simple acknowledgement that 32 years of showing up meant something, that it couldn't be erased by a forged signature and a UPS store notary stamp, that the love my father and I built across 1,000 ordinary Sunday phone calls was real and mattered, and deserved to be recorded somewhere more permanent than my own private memory. I think that's the part of this story I most want people to take away, if they take away nothing else. Fight for the truth first, and let whatever material justice follows be a consequence of that fight rather than its actual purpose. The money is nice. The money is not the point. The point was always simply this: that I refused to let anyone rewrite 32 years of real, consistent love into a footnote. And that refusal, in the end, turned out to be worth every exhausting, expensive, emotionally grueling hour it eventually cost. I want to close with one final memory, the smallest one in this whole long story, and I think, in some ways, the most important. The Sunday before my father died. Not the last Sunday of his life, technically, because he lived another 11 days after it. Most of them unconscious, most of them beyond the reach of any phone call at all. I called him at our usual time, 6 o'clock in the evening, the way I had for 32 consecutive years. He was too weak by then to hold the phone himself, so a hospice nurse held it to his ear, and I talked for nearly 20 minutes while he mostly just breathed on the other end, occasionally managing a soft, effortful that told me he could still hear me, still understood, even though he could no longer manage the easy back-and-forth conversation we'd shared for 3 decades. I told him about Ben's engineering internship. I told him the tomatoes at the farmer's market that week had reminded me of his mother-in-law's garden, not knowing yet, of course, about the tin of seeds waiting for me in a storage unit I didn't even know existed. I told him I loved him, the way I always did at the end of our Sunday calls, an ordinary, almost automatic phrase after 32 years of repetition, the kind of thing you say so often it stops feeling weighty in the moment and only reveals its actual weight much later. In retrospect, once the calls have stopped coming. "I love you too, kiddo," the hospice nurse told me he'd whispered, after she'd taken the phone back to end the call, unable to manage those particular words directly into the receiver by then, but determined, even in his final conscious days, to make sure I heard them anyway. That was our last real Sunday call, 32 years of them ending not with some grand cinematic farewell, but with the same small, quiet phrase we'd exchanged 1,000 times before, finally, fittingly, arriving one last time exactly when it mattered most. I think about that a lot, more than I think about the mediation room or the forensic accounting reports, or even the video message from his hospice bed. I think about an ordinary Sunday phone call, the 32nd to last one out of 32 years of them, ending the exact same way it always had, with love, plainly stated, showing up one final time, right on schedule, the way it always, unfailingly, had. That's what my father actually left behind. Everything else, the house, the business, the money, even the truth I fought 2 years to establish, was simply proof of it, laid out calmly on a table for anyone who needed to see it. But the thing itself, the love underneath all that proof, had never actually been in question. It had been there all along, every single Sunday for 32 consecutive years, showing up exactly when it was supposed to, whether or not anyone in that beige conference room ever bothered to notice. There's one last thing I want to mention before I close this story, small enough that I almost left it out entirely, and yet it feels, somehow, like the truest possible ending. Last spring, 70 years after my grandfather first hung the sign, we finally repainted it. The same words, the same plain black letters against white, Bennett Hardware and Supply, refreshed but unchanged, because some things, I've come to believe, are worth preserving exactly as they were, rather than reinventing simply for the sake of change. Ben came home for the weekend to help with the repainting, and Tommy Hale drove over from his retirement cottage 2 towns over just to supervise, insisting, with the stubborn authority of a man who'd spent 22 years behind that counter, that we were mixing the paint slightly too blue. We got it right eventually, the exact same shade my grandfather had chosen in 1961, matched from an old paint chip Frank Whitaker, of all people, had somehow kept filed away in a box of Bennett family records going back decades. I stood across the street that evening, watching the fresh paint catch the last of the daylight, my son beside me, my husband's arm around my shoulders, and I thought about everything that sign had survived to still be standing there, unchanged, exactly where it had always been. 2 recessions, a big box competitor, a forged will, a disbarred paralegal, a stepbrother's addiction, a stepmother's 30 years of careful, cutting favoritism, and one quiet, underestimated daughter who had simply, finally, refused to let any of it take the name down. Some things, it turns out, are worth fighting to keep exactly as they were meant to be. Not because change is bad, and not because the past deserves some uncomplicated nostalgic reverence. My father wasn't a perfect man, and I've tried, throughout this whole telling, to be honest about that. But because some inheritances, properly understood and properly defended, are worth handing forward intact, generation after generation, exactly the way they were first, faithfully built. Tommy Hale stood beside me that evening, arms crossed, studying the fresh paint with the same critical eye he'd once used to inspect a miscut board of lumber, and after a long moment he simply nodded, satisfied, the closest thing to a blessing a man like that ever offered out loud. "Your dad would say that's exactly right," he told me. "Not too flashy, just steady, just true to what it always was." I think of everything anyone said to me in the 5 years this whole story took to unfold. That plain, unadorned sentence came closest to summarizing the entire inheritance I'd fought so hard to protect. Not flashy, never flashy, just steady, and just true. If you've made it this far, I suspect you might be the quiet one in your own family too. The one who shows up without being asked. The one who absorbs the small slights because making a fuss never seemed worth the fight. The one who has, at some point, sat in a room and been told, in one way or another, that you weren't real family, weren't entitled to what you'd spent years quietly earning through nothing more dramatic than simply, consistently, being there. I want to tell you what I wish someone had told me. Sitting in that beige conference room 5 years ago, my whole understanding of my own family collapsing quietly in front of me while I tried to keep my voice steady. Your quiet is not weakness. It never was. It's a particular kind of strength that the loud people in your life have simply never had to develop, because they never needed to learn how to watch closely, wait patiently, and gather the truth carefully before they were ready to use it. Being underestimated for 30 years doesn't mean you're actually less than the people underestimating you. It usually just means nobody's bothered to notice what you're capable of yet. And when the moment finally comes, and I believe, if you're the quiet one, it usually does eventually come, you don't have to become loud to win. You don't have to burn everything down, or scream in a conference room, or become someone you don't recognize in the mirror just to finally be taken seriously. You can gather your evidence. You can call your Frank Whitaker, whoever that person is in your life, the one who's known you long enough to recognize when something doesn't sound like the person you actually are. You can sit across from the person who hurt you and lay the truth out calmly, completely, without raising your voice once, and let the truth do the loud work on your behalf, because the truth, it turns out, rarely needs your help to be devastating. Plant your garden, whatever that means for you, whatever seeds someone left behind for you to finally, someday, be ready to grow. It might take longer than you expect. Some of them might not come up at all, but some of them will, 30 years late, warm from the sun, exactly when you're finally ready to taste them. My father called me every Sunday for 32 years, and it took me most of that time to understand that the phone call itself was the inheritance, not the house, not the business, not the money, though I'm grateful, in the end, to have finally received those too, honestly, the way he always actually intended. The real inheritance was the showing up. The unglamorous, unwitnessed, Tuesday afternoon kind of love that doesn't announce itself loudly and doesn't need to, because it simply keeps calling, week after week, year after year, whether or not anyone's keeping score. Someone is always keeping score, even when it doesn't feel like it. Even when it takes 32 years, and a storage unit, and a hospice bed video, and a mediation room with a box of tissues placed in the center of the table, for the truth to finally, quietly, come home. Thank you for listening to this whole long, unhurried story. I know it took its time getting where it needed to go, but so did the truth it's built around, and I have never once regretted the years it took either one to finally arrive. Claire Bennett Millbrook, Ohio. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. So many women carry exactly this kind of quiet, unacknowledged strength, and so many of them find, eventually, that it's enough.